Al Capone, a name that once struck fear into the heart of Chicago, built an empire of crime, power, and bloodshed. But beneath the notorious gangster's brutal exterior lay a story of ambition, charm, and an insatiable thirst for control that still echoes through the shadows of history. Al Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in the heart of Brooklyn, New York, a neighborhood where dreams often collided with the harsh reality of survival. The son of Italian immigrants, Gabrielle and Teresa Capone, Al was one of 9 children, growing up in a cramped, working-class home where the air always felt heavy with struggle. His father, a barber, and his mother, a seamstress, worked tirelessly to make ends meet. But despite their best efforts, the Capone family was never quite able to escape poverty. Brooklyn, in the early 1900s, was a battleground between rising Italian-American communities and the established powers that had long dominated the streets. Young Al, with his dark eyes and sharp mind, quickly learned that power often didn't come from hard work but from control. From a young age, he was drawn to the underworld that lurked in the shadows, far from the dreams of the immigrant generation who sought better lives through honest labor. The streets of Brooklyn, where Capone ran with the other kids, became his first classroom. School didn't suit him. Al was kicked out of several institutions, a reflection of his short temper and his rebellious spirit. But it wasn't just trouble with authority that shaped him. It was the endless cycle of poverty and the allure of the promise that anyone, no matter their background, could rise to the top if they were willing to bend the rules. Capone's first brushes with the criminal world came from local street gangs, a place where loyalty was earned with blood and a handshake. By the time he was a teenager, Capone had already gained a reputation among the boys in the neighborhood. He was tough, and he knew how to survive. But there was something more to Capone than just his ability to survive. It was his ability to charm, to make people trust him, despite the roughness that surrounded him. His smile, wide and unyielding, was deceptive in its warmth. Capone was not just a boy from the streets. He was a boy who understood the way the world worked through connections, manipulation, and power. He began working for a local gangster, John Torrio, who would eventually take Capone under his wing and teach him the true mechanics of running a criminal empire. It was Torrio who first brought Capone into the world of bootlegging and racketeering, planting the seed that would grow into one of the most infamous criminal careers in history. Though his early years were marked by poverty and violence, Capone's rise was a story of self-invention. The boy from Brooklyn, who once fought for scraps, had begun to envision himself as something more, a kingpin in the making. By the time Al Capone was in his early 20s, he had already made a name for himself in Brooklyn. But it wasn't enough. The streets of New York were crowded, and the gangs he had run with were starting to feel small. Capone knew he needed to broaden his horizons, so in 1920, he packed up and headed west to Chicago, a city that was in the midst of one of its most dangerous, chaotic periods, Prohibition. It was there, amid the mix of booming crime and corruption, that Capone would find his true calling. Chicago was a different beast altogether. It was a city of endless opportunity for someone like Capone, someone who was ruthless enough to seize it. At the time, Johnny Torrio, a seasoned gangster from New York, had already established himself as a key figure in Chicago's underworld. Torrio was the kind of man who saw the big picture, and when he met Capone, he recognized something in the young man: raw potential, intelligence, and a sharp instinct for survival. It was Torrio who became Capone's mentor, taking him under his wing and introducing him to the lucrative world of bootlegging. Capone wasn't just any small-time thug anymore. He was learning the ropes from the best. He started in the low-end rackets, running small-time scams and shakedowns, but it didn't take long before he started moving up. He worked his way into Torrio's operations, overseeing bars, clubs, and even speakeasies where illegal alcohol flowed freely. all protected by Capone's growing network of muscle and influence. His ability to charm people, combined with his willingness to use force when necessary, made him both an ally to some and a nightmare to others. Capone's rise in the criminal world was swift. He wasn't afraid to take what he wanted, and he had no qualms about using violence to get it. As his operations expanded, so did his ambition. Torrio, who had been running the Chicago outfit, began to see Capone as his heir apparent. He saw in Capone a man who not only had the nerve to survive, but the smarts to thrive in a world that had little room for mistakes. But Capone wasn't content with just being a lieutenant. The more he saw of the business, the more he wanted to control it. Torrio, despite his loyalty to Capone, began to sense the rising tide of ambition in his protege, and it didn't take long before Capone made his move. When Torrio decided to retire, fearing for his life in the increasingly violent world of Chicago's crime families, Capone took over, consolidating his power and becoming the kingpin of the Chicago outfit. From street thug to mob boss, Capone's rise was fueled by a mix of cunning, ruthless ambition, and a willingness to do whatever it took to win. It wasn't just his charm that made him powerful. It was his understanding that in the world he inhabited, power was something you didn't wait for, but something you took. Al Capone's initiation into the brutal world of organized crime wasn't a sudden leap. It was a careful, calculated process of learning the ropes, one violent lesson at a time. When he first arrived in Chicago, he was just another ambitious young man with street smarts and a willingness to do what others wouldn't. But it was Johnny Torrio, the seasoned gangster who ran the outfit, who showed Capone the power of structure and chaos. Torrio wasn't just a businessman in the criminal world. He was a master strategist, and he saw potential in Capone. Torrio understood that in the world of organized crime, knowledge was power, and to rise, Capone would need to learn the trade the right way by understanding its complexities, its risks, and most importantly, its violent demands. At first, Capone started small, working his way through the ranks by running the bootlegging and gambling rackets. Prohibition had made alcohol illegal, and Capone quickly realized that the demand for booze hadn't diminished. It had only gone underground, creating a golden opportunity for those savvy enough to supply it. Torrio showed him how to manage the operation, how to distribute the goods through speakeasies and hidden bars, and how to control every link in the chain, from the production of liquor to the distribution networks that moved it through the city's streets. But Capone quickly learned that business wasn't just about selling products. It was about power, and power often required violence. To protect their turf and interests, the outfit relied on intimidation, muscle, and the constant threat of force. Capone was initiated into this violent underbelly almost immediately. When rival gangs or businessmen refused to cooperate or pay up, it was Capone's job to ensure they understood the consequences of their resistance. He didn't hesitate to enforce Torrio's will with a gun, a bat, or even a simple threat. As he grew more trusted by his superiors, Capone's role evolved, and he became involved in more than just bootlegging. He was soon handling prostitution rings, managing gambling operations, and running protection rackets. It was in these darker corners of the criminal world where Capone's ruthless efficiency began to shine. He saw opportunity where others saw risk, and he understood that, in this business, survival wasn't about avoiding trouble, it was about controlling it. He started to build his own alliances, forming relationships with politicians, police officers, and union leaders. Torrio was teaching him more than how to make money. He was teaching Capone how to wield influence and navigate the dangerous political landscape of Chicago's underworld. By the time Capone took full control of the outfit, he wasn't just another gangster. He had learned the trade inside and out, how to operate the business, how to handle the violence, and how to manipulate the city's systems to his advantage. The young man who had once worked the streets of Brooklyn was now a force to be reckoned with in Chicago, having mastered the art of both crime and power. When Al Capone first set foot in Chicago, the city was a battleground of crime, a place where every street corner and every speakeasy was contested by ruthless gangs vying for dominance. The wind-swept alleys were filled with the promise of money, but also the looming threat of death. It was a city where power was won not by kindness, but by force. For Capone, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. He wasn't just entering a city, he was entering the most dangerous underworld in the United States. And in it, he would carve out his empire. At the time, Chicago was ruled by several factions, each looking to stake their claim in the lucrative world of bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution that had emerged during Prohibition. The most powerful of these groups was the South Side Italian outfit, led by Johnny Torrio. Torrio, a seasoned gangster from New York, had already established himself in the city's criminal world. But the rise of rival gangs, including the Irish-led North Side Gang, was starting to shift the balance of power. The North Side, led by the ambitious and violent Dean O'Banion, controlled key areas of the city, and tensions between the two factions were simmering. The competition was fierce, and survival wasn't guaranteed. No one was safe, not even the most powerful. Capone, though new to the city, quickly recognized the stakes. He understood that in this business, alliances were just as important as weapons, and trust was more valuable than gold. Under Torrio's mentorship, Capone learned the game from the inside out: how to gain territory, how to protect it, and how to crush anyone who dared to stand in his way. Torrio's method was often subtle, using bribery and influence to control the police and politicians. But Capone had a more direct approach. He had learned from the streets of Brooklyn that if someone didn't bend, they had to be broken. Soon, the rivalry between the South Side outfit and the North Side gang escalated into violence. Shootouts in the streets became common, and no one, from the common folk to the city's lawmen, was immune to the chaos. Capone wasn't afraid of the bloodshed. In fact, he thrived in it. He launched calculated attacks against O'Banion's men, ambushing them when they least expected it, killing off rivals, and taking control of their businesses. He wasn't just fighting for territory, he was sending a message that he was there to stay. The competition didn't end with the North Side. As Capone expanded his influence, he found himself dealing with the growing threat of other organized crime bosses, including the likes of George Bugs, Moran, and other smaller gangs that had their eyes on the same prize. But Capone's ability to manipulate, intimidate, and eliminate threats put him head and shoulders above the rest. He made sure that the businesses in Chicago, whether they were speakeasies, gambling dens, or brothels, paid their protection fees, or they learned the consequences. Capone's rise in the Chicago underworld wasn't just about taking control of the city. It was about proving that he was the one who would define the rules. He had entered a city full of dangerous men, but he quickly became the most dangerous of them all. Johnny Torrio saw something in Al Capone that many others missed: a cold ambition wrapped in a friendly smile. Torrio, a seasoned gangster with years of experience running illegal operations in Chicago, knew that to dominate the city, he needed someone who could execute his plans with ruthless precision. Capone was that someone. Though he was younger, brash, and unrefined compared to Torrio, Capone possessed an undeniable knack for both business and violence. Torrio recognized this quickly and took the young man under his wing, teaching him the intricacies of running a criminal empire. Under Torrio's mentorship, Capone learned the value of patience, discretion, and the subtlety of control. Torrio wasn't the kind of man who wanted to start a street brawl with every rival he met. He preferred to work quietly, ensuring that everything ran smoothly with the right people in place. He was a master of bribery and manipulation, often negotiating behind closed doors with politicians, lawmen, and business owners. Capone, though more accustomed to direct confrontation, started to see the power of influencing people from the shadows. He learned how to make connections with the right individuals, how to keep the police on his side, and how to protect his empire from the growing number of threats in Chicago. Torrio also introduced Capone to the finer art of running a vast, organized business. The Southside outfit had already cornered much of the bootlegging market, and Capone's ability to manage operations quickly became apparent. Together, they expanded their reach across the city, controlling speakeasies, gambling houses, and brothels, while also keeping their hands clean by avoiding overt violence. Torrio was careful in his approach, often using threats and subtle tactics to keep rivals at bay. But Capone's more aggressive style soon became the dominant force in the partnership. Torrio would lay the groundwork, and Capone would finish the job with his signature brutal efficiency. Their partnership also proved profitable. As the demand for bootlegged alcohol soared during Prohibition, the outfit's profits skyrocketed. Torrio understood the importance of diversification, and he pushed Capone to expand into other lucrative areas of crime, such as protection rackets and illegal gambling. With Capone's growing influence, the outfit became not just a gang but a full-blown criminal empire. Capone proved to be more than just a muscleman. He was a businessman, a strategist, and, most of all, a leader. As Capone's star rose, so did Torrio's trust in him. Torrio increasingly relied on Capone to handle more of the day-to-day operations, delegating the dirty work to his protege. It wasn't long before Torrio, tired of the constant danger and attention, decided it was time to step back. He saw that Capone was ready to take the reins and, with a sense of both pride and caution, handed over control of the outfit to him. Capone's rise to power was swift and inevitable, but it was Torrio who had shaped the foundation of the empire. Capone would come to rule with an iron fist. As Capone's influence grew in Chicago, so did his grip on the South Side, the area that would become the heart of his empire. The South Side was a patchwork of neighborhoods teeming with immigrants, small businesses, and the city's most lucrative illegal markets. It was the perfect breeding ground for Capone's ambitions. He wasn't content with simply being a player in Chicago's underworld. He wanted to dominate it, and to do that, he had to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to his rule. At first, Capone's methods were subtle. He relied heavily on the experience and tactics he had learned from Johnny Torrio, using bribery and corruption to buy off politicians, police officers, and other key figures in the city. He understood the value of having the law on his side and quickly set up a network of people who could make problems disappear with a well-timed payment or a well-placed threat. His men infiltrated local governments, unions, and businesses, ensuring that Capone's interests were always protected. This strategy, though effective, wasn't enough to silence the growing number of rivals who coveted the same slice of Chicago. By the late 1920s, Capone knew that to truly solidify his hold on power, he had to eliminate the competition. Rival gangs, particularly the North Side Irish and the remaining pockets of O'Banion's crew, were a constant thorn in his side. But Capone was never one to shy away from violence when necessary. He took a much more direct approach than his mentor, Torrio. Rival gang members were ambushed, their businesses destroyed, and their leaders either driven out of the city or killed. Capone was careful, though he didn't engage in blind, chaotic violence. He targeted the weak spots, the moments when his enemies were vulnerable. One of Capone's most notorious moves came in 1929, when he orchestrated the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The execution-style killings of 7 members of George Bugs Moran's gang were a direct message from Capone. The murder was brutal and cold, but it was also calculated. Moran was Capone's primary rival on the North Side, and his elimination would send shockwaves through the city. The massacre was a warning to any other gang leader who thought they could challenge Capone's authority. The public was horrified, but in the criminal world, the message was clear: Capone ruled with impunity, and anyone who dared to challenge him would face the same fate. Capone also used his connections with local politicians and law enforcement to fortify his position. He had a knack for making deals with those in power, offering protection and influence in exchange for loyalty. He surrounded himself with loyalists, men who were willing to do anything to keep the money flowing. His ability to manipulate the political landscape gave him a nearly unassailable position in the city. By the early 1930s, Capone had achieved what many thought was impossible. He had consolidated his control over Chicago's South Side, and, by extension, the majority of the city's criminal enterprises. His empire stretched from bootlegging to gambling, prostitution, and extortion. Capone wasn't just a gangster. He was a king in a city that ran on corruption and fear. Prohibition was a blessing for Al Capone, transforming his criminal empire from a series of small-time rackets into a global powerhouse. When the Volstead Act made alcohol illegal in 1920, Capone saw an opportunity to control the one thing the entire country craved: liquor. What began as a means of survival turned into a booming business, one that fueled Capone's rise from a local gangster to the most feared man in America. The bootlegging business, though illegal, was the lifeblood of Capone's operations. He didn't just smuggle alcohol into Chicago. He controlled every aspect of the distribution network. From the moment it arrived in the city, Capone's men ensured it got to the speakeasies, clubs, and bars where thirsty patrons were willing to pay top dollar. To make sure his liquor was the only game in town, Capone used brute force and fear to eliminate his competitors. He made sure his shipments ran smoothly, cutting deals with corrupt officials, police officers, and even gangsters who'd previously been a threat to his empire. Capone's wealth grew exponentially as his bootlegging empire expanded. He bought up warehouses, distribution centers, and secret drop-off locations in and around Chicago, creating a near impenetrable network. Capone even had private trucks and boats to move alcohol into the city without being detected by the authorities. His control over the trade was absolute. No rival gang dared to challenge him, for fear of violent retribution. Even the city's police force, bought off by Capone's massive bribes, looked the other way as his operations flourished. With the fortune Capone accumulated from bootlegging, he didn't just buy luxury cars and homes. He built an empire. He funded political campaigns, placing his men in positions of power to protect his interests. His bribes were so vast and influential that Capone effectively controlled large swaths of Chicago. His reach stretched into every corner of the city, and the authorities, whether local or federal, were either powerless or complicit in his rise. But Capone didn't stop there. He understood that to truly solidify his power, he needed more than just alcohol. He expanded his operations into gambling, prostitution, and labor racketeering, diversifying his wealth and influence. Each new venture allowed him to solidify his status as a kingpin. While prohibition was the driving force behind his rise, Capone wasn't just a product of circumstance. He was a master manipulator, a businessman who understood that power wasn't just about controlling what people wanted, but about controlling how they got it. By the time prohibition was repealed in 1933, Capone had already cemented his place as one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country. His bootlegging empire was the foundation upon which he built the rest of his criminal enterprise, and it would be the key to his legend. But even as the law caught up with him, Capone's grip on Chicago remained ironclad, a testament to the empire he built on the backs of both corruption and violence. The morning of February 14, 1929, in Chicago was like any other, chilly and gray, a city pulsing with the usual rhythm of life. But for 7 members of George Bugs Moran's North Side gang, it would be the last morning they would ever see. In what became one of the most infamous acts of violence in American history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre unfolded, an execution that would not only erase a rival gang, but also solidify Capone's reputation as a ruthless, untouchable force in the city's underworld. It was an orchestrated slaughter, planned with chilling precision. Capone, ever the tactician, knew that to maintain his stranglehold on Chicago's criminal empire, Moran had to go. Moran's gang had been a thorn in Capone's side for years, and their recent interference in Capone's business deals was the final straw. The plan was simple: lure Moran's men into a trap, eliminate them in broad daylight, and send a clear message to anyone who dared challenge Capone's reign. The setup was executed with military-like coordination. On that fateful morning, a group of men, dressed as uniformed policemen, entered the garage at 2122 North Clark Street, where Moran's men were meeting. The men were rounded up, lined up against a wall, and executed in cold blood. Tommy guns roared, cutting down the gang members in a hail of bullets. The scene was horrifying. Blood spattered the walls, pooling on the floor, as the bodies of men who had once been at the top of the city's criminal hierarchy fell to the ground. When the smoke cleared, 7 men lay dead, their lives extinguished in mere moments. But the aftermath was almost as shocking as the massacre itself. While Capone's men had executed the hit flawlessly, they hadn't anticipated the level of attention it would garner. The police, already stretched thin, trying to deal with the wave of crime in the city, were forced into a public investigation, and the brutality of the massacre left an indelible mark on the American public's consciousness. Capone, ever the master of discretion, had hoped that the massacre would go unnoticed by law enforcement, but it was too high-profile a crime to simply sweep under the rug. The media went wild, and the case became a symbol of the lawlessness that Capone's empire thrived in. In the weeks that followed, Capone did everything in his power to cover up his involvement. He used his connections with the police and politicians to deflect attention away from his role in the massacre. He even went so far as to publicly distance himself from Moran, claiming that he had no reason to be involved in such a brutal act. But the damage had been done. While he managed to avoid direct suspicion, the massacre was a stain on his reputation, even among the criminal elite. Though it didn't bring about his downfall, the St. Valentine's Day massacre was a moment that marked Capone's reign with terror, a reminder of how far he would go to crush his enemies. In the end, it was not the law that brought Capone to his knees, but the ruthless efficiency with which he eliminated anyone who posed a threat to his power. His name, forever linked to the massacre, would become synonymous with bloodshed, intimidation, and the kind of empire built on violence. Al Capone was the epitome of contradictions. To the public, he was a charming, friendly figure, the smiling psychopath who could melt a crowd with his warm demeanor and generous gestures. He posed for photos, shaking hands with politicians, attending lavish parties, and even appearing in public without a trace of the violence that ran through his criminal empire. He was the face of the people's hero, the man who built homes, funded hospitals, and handed out turkeys to the poor during the holidays. But behind that ever-present smile lay a darker, far more sinister side, a side that was quick to eliminate anyone who threatened his empire. Capone knew that appearances were everything. He was a master manipulator, using his friendly, approachable public persona as a tool to control and command. In the public eye, he was the guy who would sit down with a struggling family, ask about their kids, and promise to make life easier for them. But when the doors closed, when the press cameras stopped rolling, Capone's persona melted away. That same charming smile would transform into something far more dangerous, a cold mask of control that would make anyone in his circle second-guess their safety. He used his charm to weave a web of influence, drawing in politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement who would turn a blind eye to his illicit operations. To the outsiders, Capone was just a successful businessman, a man who made things happen, who was deeply embedded in the fabric of Chicago's growth. He was the face of the underworld, yes, but he was also a man people trusted because they never saw him coming. His personality was his greatest asset, a weapon as sharp as any Tommy gun or knife. But his private world, the one that functioned in the shadows of Chicago, was filled with brutality. The same hands that signed checks to local churches and charities were capable of destroying a man in the blink of an eye. Capone was never afraid to get his hands dirty. When rivals or traitors crossed the line, his smile would fade, and the public's image of him as a philanthropist would vanish. In its place, a fearsome boss emerged, one who could send his men on missions of terror without hesitation, using silence as his most deadly tool. What made Capone even more dangerous was how he manipulated people's perceptions of him. He convinced the public that he was just one of them, that he had no hidden agenda, no desire for power beyond what was already visible. Yet, behind every handshake, every friendly word, Capone was calculating, watching, and manipulating. The same people who called him a friend were often the very ones who ended up at the business end of his wrath. Capone's ability to balance his public image with his brutal methods was what made him so elusive and powerful. He built a kingdom on both charm and fear, a kingdom that would come to dominate Chicago. But in the quiet moments, when the city's lights dimmed, the smiling psychopath behind the empire was always there, watching, waiting. And the moment someone threatened the fragile peace he'd created, that smile would be gone in an instant. Capone understood something that many others in the criminal world never fully grasped. Fear was just as powerful, if not more so, than respect. He didn't just want people to fear him, he wanted them to respect him, too. And he knew exactly how to balance the two in a way that gave him control over Chicago's underworld. His reputation was built on an aura of invincibility, and Capone worked tirelessly to ensure that people saw him not only as a force of nature, but as a man whose power was undeniable. Fear was Capone's most potent weapon. He ruled by creating a landscape of terror, where his word was law, and disobedience was met with violent retribution. It wasn't just the brutal acts of violence, though those were expected in his world. It was the unpredictability that made him terrifying. His ability to carry out cold-blooded acts of murder and then switch to charming banter over a meal was what kept everyone on edge. No one knew when the smiling, friendly Capone would disappear, replaced by the ruthless criminal mastermind who would silence a threat without a second thought. But fear alone doesn't build empires. Capone knew that to dominate, he also needed respect. Respect didn't come through terror alone. It came through loyalty, through making people feel like they owed their success to him. He was more than just a gangster. He was a man who could shape lives, who could elevate people from obscurity to power within his world. This blend of fear and respect created a tight-knit network of loyalty, one that ran deep in his ranks. Capone made sure that those who worked for him felt both indebted and obligated, not just out of fear of what he might do if they crossed him, but because they understood the value he brought to their lives. His underworld empire was a place where loyalty meant everything. Those who followed him were given protection, money, and power. But those who crossed him, those who betrayed him, faced the full brunt of his fury. To cross Capone was to put a target on your back, but even then, it wasn't just the threat of death that made people fall in line. It was the respect they had for the man who had crafted a criminal empire so vast that even the police and politicians couldn't touch him. Capone wasn't just feared by his enemies, he was respected by them as well. Even rival gangs understood that he was not to be trifled with. He had a reputation for not only crushing his adversaries, but for doing so with such methodical precision that others quickly learned to keep their distance. And while his brutality was the stuff of legends, it was his ability to inspire both fear and respect in equal measure that solidified his dominance in Chicago. It was this combination that allowed Capone to sit at the top of his world, revered and feared by those who lived in it. The story of Capone's downfall is inseparable from the story of the men who dared to chase him. These were the lawmen who, with dogged determination, stood in defiance of Capone's empire, knowing full well the risks they were taking. They became legends in their own right, not for the wealth or power they amassed, but for the courage to challenge one of the most powerful men in America. The Untouchables, as they would come to be known, were a small but relentless group of law enforcement officers, led by the unflinching Elliot Ness. Their pursuit of Capone wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about fighting an entrenched system of corruption, violence, and fear that had turned Chicago into a city where the law didn't matter. Capone's reach extended far beyond his criminal operations. It stretched into the very heart of the city's political and police forces. The challenge wasn't simply catching him, it was getting to the truth, peeling back the layers of influence, bribery, and threats that shielded him from justice. Ness and his team were a breath of fresh air in a city suffocating under Capone's rule. They weren't bought off. They weren't intimidated. They were determined to bring Capone to justice, even if it meant putting their lives on the line. But pursuing Capone was no easy task. He wasn't just a gangster hiding out in the shadows, he was a force of nature, untouchable to most of the city's legal authorities. His vast criminal empire was built on a network of fear and loyalty, a machine so well-oiled that it seemed impossible to dismantle. He had friends in high places, corrupt cops on his payroll, and even politicians who owed him favors. The weight of Capone's empire made him a near-impossible target, and the untouchables had to navigate a world where the law was often irrelevant. Ness and his men were faced with one obstacle after another. They were up against more than just Capone's wealth and connections. They were fighting a system that seemed rigged against them. Information was scarce, and any leads they followed were often dead ends or traps set by Capone's operatives. But Ness, with his no-nonsense attitude, was relentless. His team, small and hand-picked for their unwavering integrity, began to focus on the one area that Capone thought he could escape: his finances. The untouchables went after Capone's empire where it hurt the most: his bank accounts. They couldn't touch him for murder or violence, but they could go after his illegal wealth. This pursuit would eventually lead to Capone's conviction, not for his violent crimes, but for tax evasion, a tactic that stunned Capone and his allies. But the victory wasn't just in the arrest, it was in the knowledge that even someone as powerful as Capone wasn't above the law. In the end, it wasn't brute force or bullets that brought Capone down. It was the relentless, quiet determination of a few men who refused to be intimidated by fear or corruption. The untouchables might not have been as famous as Capone, but their legacy was one of justice in a time when it seemed impossible to find. Al Capone's ability to balance brutality with charm was one of his most powerful tools. While he ruled with an iron fist in the criminal underworld, his public persona was that of a charming, generous businessman. To the public, Capone wasn't just the feared gangster. He was also a benefactor, a man who would stop to hand out money to the poor, fund local charities, and support public projects. These acts of kindness weren't merely selfless, they were calculated, a means of securing loyalty from the people of Chicago. They helped to maintain the image of the Robin Hood figure that Capone worked so hard to cultivate. Capone's philanthropy wasn't just about giving money, it was about winning hearts. He funded soup kitchens during the Great Depression, providing meals for the city's most vulnerable. He built schools and playgrounds, using these projects to bolster his image as a protector of the people. In the neighborhoods where he operated, he was often viewed as a hero, a man who did more for the community than the local government. Capone understood the power of image, and he used his wealth not only to fuel his criminal empire, but also to secure his place in the hearts of the public. However, the contradiction between Capone's acts of kindness and his brutal criminal activities was glaring. For every dollar he donated, there was blood on the street to match it. Capone wasn't just a businessman in the traditional sense, he was a ruthless killer, using fear and violence to control Chicago's criminal activities. His money came from bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution, industries that wreaked havoc on families and communities. Yet, he continued to project himself as a protector of the same people he was harming. His kindness was a tool, a strategic move to make the public feel indebted to him, to soften the blows of his criminal empire. People looked the other way when Capone's men brutalized his enemies, because they saw him as a man who gave back, who helped when no one else would. Capone's charm allowed him to manipulate public perception, blurring the lines between his violent actions and his philanthropic gestures. It was this duality that made Capone both feared and admired. The same man who could walk into a community meeting with a warm smile and hand out cash was also the man who ordered executions without hesitation. The contradictions were clear to anyone who looked closely, but for the average Chicagoan, the kindness often overshadowed the violence. And in the end, it was this image, the generous, smiling mob boss, that allowed Capone to maintain his grip on the city long after his criminal activities became more widely known. His charm was as much a part of his empire as his guns and his bribes. In the world that Capone inhabited, loyalty wasn't just a virtue, it was the cornerstone upon which everything was built. The Mafia's code, known as Omerta, or the Code of Silence, was an unspoken rule that governed every aspect of mob life. To break it meant not only betrayal of the family, but also an inevitable death sentence. This code was as vital as any weapon in Capone's arsenal, and it was one he adhered to with unwavering devotion. Capone's loyalty to his fellow mobsters was legendary, and in return, his subordinates were equally loyal to him. His rise to power wasn't just about violent ambition, it was about cultivating a brotherhood that would stand by him through everything. He fostered an environment where loyalty was everything, where betraying the family was the ultimate sin. The idea was simple. You protect the family, and the family will protect you. Capone's men were bound by an unbreakable trust, and their allegiance to him was as much about fear as it was about respect. For Capone, loyalty wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Mobsters who worked under Capone were more than just employees. They were part of a tight-knit family that operated with an almost military precision. Trust was paramount in this world, and for Capone, trust was something that had to be earned. He surrounded himself with men who were loyal, who could keep their mouths shut when necessary, and who would take a bullet without hesitation for him. Capone didn't just make his subordinates wealthy, he made them part of his world, part of a brotherhood that transcended money and violence. For Capone, the Mafia wasn't just a business, it was a family, and family meant everything. But this loyalty was tested repeatedly, as the underworld often does. The Mafia, by nature, is a world built on competition, and Capone's empire was constantly under siege by rival factions and new power players. In his quest to maintain control over Chicago, Capone relied heavily on the loyalty of his men, ensuring that they remained tight-lipped and devoted to him. Betrayal wasn't tolerated, and there were always whispers about what would happen to those who crossed the line. The punishment for breaking the code was swift and merciless, a constant reminder of the stakes at play. Capone's relationship with his fellow mobsters was complex. He was both a mentor and a tyrant, a man who demanded absolute loyalty, but who also made sure his men were rewarded for their unwavering service. His inner circle, those who had been with him from the beginning, were treated like family. They received the perks that came with power, money, protection, and status. For Capone, the loyalty he demanded was always reciprocated, and as long as you played by the rules, the rewards were plentiful. In this world, there was no room for weakness or disloyalty. If you were in Capone's inner circle, you were in it for life. That bond of loyalty was what kept his empire intact, and it was that bond that would eventually define Capone's reign until the day it all came crashing down. As Capone's power grew, so did the number of people who stood in opposition to him. His empire, built on bootlegging, gambling, and corruption, attracted the ire of not just rival mobsters, but also local politicians, law enforcement, and even those within his own organization. Capone's rise to dominance came at a price. He had made powerful enemies in high places, and those enemies had a far-reaching influence that could, if unchecked, bring everything crashing down. Capone's relationship with politicians was a complex web of bribery, manipulation, and a constant struggle for control. He'd learned early on that to rule a city like Chicago, you had to control more than just the streets. You had to control the people in charge of running the city. He did this by buying off local politicians, ensuring they would turn a blind eye to his illegal activities, or better yet, support them. But while some politicians were easily swayed by Capone's wealth and influence, others refused to be bought. These men became a problem, particularly when they began to expose the corruption that Capone had built into the fabric of Chicago's government. The greatest enemy Capone faced from within the political world came from the crusading journalists and public figures who began to expose his criminal activities. They painted him as the head of a violent, corrupt empire, and Capone hated them for it. He didn't like being portrayed as a monster in the press. He wanted to be seen as a businessman, as a man who was simply playing by the rules of the street. The media, however, refused to let him off the hook. As they pushed forward with their exposes, Capone's wrath grew. He tried to silence them through threats, intimidation, and, at times, violence. But even with all his power, Capone couldn't control the press entirely, and the stories about his criminal empire continued to spread. Of course, no one in the world of organized crime is ever safe from a rival, and Capone's competition came from all sides. While he dominated the south side of Chicago, other factions, most notably the North Side Irish mob, were vying for power, and they didn't take kindly to Capone's expansion. The battle for control of Chicago's lucrative vice rackets quickly turned violent, with shootings and bombings becoming commonplace. Capone fought back fiercely, eliminating anyone who stood in his way. But these rivalries were dangerous not just because of the bloodshed. They also put Capone in direct conflict with law enforcement. The police were always looking for ways to take him down, and with the growing violence between mobs, they had all the reason they needed. Capone's biggest challenge came from within the law itself. The federal government, along with local police, were starting to see him as the single greatest threat to public order, and they came after him with everything they had. Yet, for all his brutality and cunning, Capone found himself increasingly vulnerable as his enemies in high places grew stronger and more determined. The very people he had bribed, the very people he had once manipulated, were beginning to turn against him. It was a warning sign. In the world of organized crime, your enemies never remain the same. They adapt, they grow more powerful, and, eventually, they get you. Al Capone's relationships with women were as complex and contradictory as the man himself. On the surface, he presented the image of a devoted husband, fiercely protective of his wife, May, who was by his side through both the rise and fall of his criminal empire. Their marriage, though rooted in love, was never without its complications. May was not just a wife in the traditional sense. She was a partner in the most challenging aspects of Capone's life, a woman who, in her own way, had to be as tough as the man she married. Capone, ever the protector, kept her shielded from the brutal realities of his work. But May was no fool. She understood the nature of her husband's business, the darkness that followed him wherever he went, and she remained loyal to him, even when the public turned their backs. But Capone's relationships with women were not confined to the woman he married. His mistresses were another piece of the puzzle, and they played a role in the world Capone had built, one that mixed business and pleasure in a way that only a man like him could. He treated his mistresses with the same ruthlessness as his criminal operations, using them not just for companionship, but for further control and influence. The women who entered his life were often used as tools, pawns in a larger game of manipulation and power. However, they were also part of the charade Capone built for the public. To the outside world, he was the smiling, charming gangster with a loyal wife and a perfect family. To his mistresses, he was a king in his own right, unstoppable and dangerous, with an allure that captivated anyone in his orbit. Despite his many affairs, Capone's true devotion lay with May. She was the one person who could get close to the heart of a man who otherwise wore a mask of power, cruelty, and detachment. When Capone's empire was at its height, he was careful to keep his personal life protected from the public eye. He knew that the image of a strong, family-centered man would serve him well, especially when it came to maintaining the loyalty of those around him. May, with her calm demeanor and ability to keep Capone grounded, was the perfect match for the image he wanted to project. But the reality of Capone's life was far darker. As he grew more powerful, his relationships with women, whether they were mistresses or companions, became increasingly strained. The constant danger that came with his lifestyle, the paranoia, and the never-ending pressure all took their toll on the emotional side of his relationships. His mistresses, like the women he used to further his criminal empire, were often discarded when they no longer served a purpose. His wife, May, remained a steady presence, but even she couldn't escape the shadows of his world. In the end, the women in Capone's life played crucial roles, but they were often pawns in a game that Capone controlled. Whether he loved them or used them, the truth remained the same. Women, like everything else in his world, were either a tool or a threat, to be kept close or cast aside. And through it all, May stood by him, the one person who never faltered until the end, when even she couldn't escape the consequences of his empire. Al Capone's ability to maintain his charm and popularity, despite the violence that marked his criminal empire, was a masterclass in manipulation. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a brand, a persona that captivated the public and kept them both terrified and enamored. Capone understood the power of image better than most, recognizing that while his actions spoke of brutality, his smile and smooth talk could soften even the most damning of narratives. He played the media like a finely tuned instrument, giving them just enough to keep the public intrigued without fully exposing his inner workings. One of Capone's most striking qualities was his charisma. He had a way with people that was both disarming and dangerous. His charm wasn't just reserved for the high society or his business associates. It was a tool he wielded to control and manipulate anyone who crossed his path. Whether he was shaking hands with the working class or posing for photos with politicians, Capone knew how to project an image of affability. He could smile his way through a room, leaving everyone with the sense that he was a likable, even generous, man. It was a facade that allowed him to navigate the world with ease, wrapping the public around his finger. The media, both local and national, played right into his hands. While law enforcement pursued him relentlessly, the press often portrayed him as something of a folk hero, especially to those in Chicago's South Side, who saw him as a provider of jobs, housing, and even welfare in a city that had long ignored them. Capone was quick to recognize the power of the media, using it to spin his own narrative. When his name appeared in the headlines, it wasn't always for the violent actions he had orchestrated. Often, it was framed as a tale of a man who helped the little guy, a philanthropist who had a penchant for charity as much as he had for violence. It was the perfect contradiction, and it worked. This carefully crafted image allowed Capone to remain untouchable in the eyes of many. While his rivals might be portrayed as cold-blooded killers, Capone was the man who threw lavish parties, who handed out turkeys at Christmas, who built schools and funded hospitals. The press was complicit, often downplaying the extent of his criminal activities in favor of these more human aspects of his persona. As the years wore on, the line between Capone the gangster and Capone the charismatic kingpin became increasingly blurred, making it difficult for the public to truly grasp the extent of his malevolence. Even as his empire began to crumble under the weight of law enforcement and rival gangs, Capone's popularity remained. He had ingrained himself in the fabric of Chicago's identity, and his name carried weight even as his empire faltered. In the end, Capone's charisma wasn't just a personal trait, it was a strategic weapon that allowed him to remain a figure of intrigue and admiration. Even as the bloodshed and betrayal he orchestrated left a lasting scar on the city. As Capone's empire continued to grow, so did the pressure on the federal government to take him down. While local law enforcement had struggled to penetrate his organization, The federal government saw an opportunity to strike at the heart of Capone's operations, not through the violence that had defined him, but through the very financial system he had used to launder his enormous profits. The turning point came when the government shifted its focus from his crimes on the streets to his taxes and financial records. It was a tactic that Capone, so often able to dodge bullets and evade the law, had not anticipated. The government's strategy was simple: hit him where it hurt the most. Capone had built his fortune on bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and a series of illegal ventures that flourished in the Prohibition era, but he had done so without paying taxes. As the government dug into his financial records, they discovered a pattern of deliberate tax evasion that couldn't be ignored. Capone had been living a lavish lifestyle, flaunting wealth and power, but it was now evident that he had failed to report his earnings. The very foundation of his empire, built on illicit gains, was vulnerable to the law. The federal government, armed with a team of agents led by the determined Elliot Ness and his famous untouchables, began to close in on Capone. They didn't need to rely on the usual methods of bribery or muscle this time. They had the law on their side. Through meticulous investigation, they followed the trail of money, piecing together his vast illegal empire from the ground up. Capone, for all his power, could not escape the financial paper trail that he had so carefully attempted to obscure. For years, Capone had evaded prosecution for his crimes through intimidation, bribes, and the silence of his men. But the government's tax case was different. It didn't rely on witnesses or the usual street-level violence. It simply required an accounting of his wealth, something Capone had neglected to cover up properly. The net was tightening, and Capone, often too focused on his empire's growth, underestimated the threat posed by the government's financial investigations. In 1931, the government made its move. They brought charges of tax evasion against Capone, and this time, the case stuck. Despite his efforts to escape, the once untouchable mob boss was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 11 years in prison. It was a remarkable turn of events for a man who had been practically untouchable for so long, proving that no matter how powerful or ruthless someone may be, the law, in the end, would find a way. Capone's downfall didn't come in a hail of bullets, but in the quiet, calculated work of financial investigators who had managed to outsmart the king of crime at his own game. Capone's reach extended far beyond the gritty streets of Chicago. His influence seeped into cities across the country, creating a vast national network of organized crime. Central to this expansion were the relationships he fostered with other key figures in the underworld, including the notorious Bugsy Siegel. While Capone had made his name through bootlegging and his stranglehold over Chicago's South Side, Siegel brought with him a different kind of ambition, one that involved the glitz and glamour of the West Coast. Bugsy Siegel was a man of sharp contrasts, a ruthless killer and an ambitious visionary who set his sights on the emerging world of Las Vegas. Capone saw potential in Siegel's vision, recognizing the value of tapping into the growing influence of the entertainment and gambling industries. The two men had more in common than just their criminal tendencies. Both had aspirations that stretched beyond the typical mobster's territory. Capone, who had solidified his power in Chicago, began to see the broader picture, where his operations could thrive in the shadows of legitimate businesses. In places like Hollywood and the burgeoning Las Vegas Strip, Siegel, as a rising figure within the national network of criminals, had connections that helped Capone's empire branch out. While Capone's day-to-day operations in Chicago were efficient and brutal, Siegel's influence took things to a different level, especially when it came to integrating gambling with organized crime. It was Siegel's drive to create the Flamingo Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas that would eventually propel him into the spotlight. And while Siegel would later meet a violent end, his connection to Capone marked a shift in the criminal landscape, a shift that saw the mafia expanding into new, untapped territories. Through Siegel, Capone was able to extend his reach into the West Coast, cementing his national influence. It wasn't just about controlling the liquor trade or keeping the South Side under his thumb anymore. Capone's empire began to stretch its tendrils into the most lucrative markets of the country, including gambling and the casino industry. And Capone had learned to stay connected to these emerging opportunities through men like Siegel. As Capone's empire grew, so did his understanding of the interconnected nature of organized crime across the country. While Capone was often the public face of the Chicago outfit, it was his relationships with men like Siegel, along with his ability to recognize and seize opportunities, that allowed his influence to spread far beyond Chicago. Capone's ability to navigate the national criminal network not only helped solidify his position at the top, but ensured that, for a time, the world of organized crime would bend to his will. The 1920s were a time of contradictions, a decade marked by excess, rebellion, and rapid transformation. It was an era defined by the Prohibition Law, which banned the sale of alcohol across the United States, yet also fueled the rise of organized crime. At the heart of this seismic shift stood Al Capone and his criminal empire, whose reach and influence shaped not only the economic and social landscape of the decade, but the very fabric of its culture. Capone's empire was built on the bootlegging trade, capitalizing on the government's attempt to curb alcohol consumption by offering a forbidden product that Americans were still hungry for. As a result, Capone became synonymous with the Roaring Twenties, a man whose criminal activity was as high profile as the jazz-filled nights and flapper dresses of the time. The speakeasies and underground clubs, tucked away in every major city, were not only havens for the rebellious youth of the decade, but also places where Capone's empire thrived. His wealth, which flowed like the very liquor he supplied, allowed him to mix with the rich and the famous, giving him a certain status that made him a larger-than-life figure in both the criminal world and popular culture. Capone was not just a mobster, he was a symbol of the times. His brazen disregard for the law, his indulgent lifestyle, and his dominance over Chicago's underworld represented the Roaring Twenties at its most defiant. His public image, cultivated with calculated charm and philanthropic gestures, gave him an aura of respectability that was both contradictory and fascinating. While the average American struggled through the Great Depression that followed, Capone's criminal activities continued to fuel an underground economy that contributed to the social fabric of the decade. Organized crime flourished under Capone's rule, but its impact went beyond the illegal trade. It penetrated everyday life in ways many didn't fully grasp. From the labor rackets to the politicians in his pocket, Capone's influence bled into the institutions that governed American life. As Capone built his empire, he also built relationships with key figures in business and politics, demonstrating the integration of organized crime with mainstream society. This connection blurred the lines between legitimate enterprises and illicit activity, establishing a precedent for how powerful figures in organized crime could manipulate the system to their advantage. As much as Capone was a symbol of the Roaring Twenties spirit of rebellion, he also left a lasting mark on the era's perception of wealth, power, and lawlessness. His empire was built on the exploitation of a society that, at times, seemed more enamored with his bravado and success than concerned with the brutality and destruction left in his wake. In a sense, Capone was not just a product of the decade he shaped it, casting a long shadow over the cultural and economic landscape of the time. As the decade ended, Capone's legacy remained tied to the roaring buzz of the 1920s, a reminder of how crime and culture became inextricably linked in the pulse of America's most decadent age. As the years wore on, the once untouchable king of Chicago began to feel the tightening noose around his neck. Capone, who had once exuded confidence and controlled the streets with a smile and a gun, found himself consumed by a growing paranoia. His world, once filled with power and influence, started to crumble as his enemies closed in from all sides. Law enforcement had long been hunting him, but it wasn't just the authorities that Capone feared now. It was the very people who had once been his loyal allies. Betrayal was now a constant in his life, and each step he took felt like a calculated move to protect himself from a network of enemies who seemed to be multiplying every day. Capone's lavish lifestyle, once a symbol of his triumph, had become a gilded cage. The walls of his estate, once filled with the sound of laughter and luxury, now felt oppressive and hollow. His once powerful empire was fragmented, and the whispers of his declining health only added to the tension. Rumors swirled that his mental state was deteriorating, a product of the constant stress and fear of impending capture. He had been living in a constant state of alert, and it was starting to take its toll. The man who had once walked with confidence now paced the halls of his mansion, a shadow of the empire he had built. Capone's downfall was inevitable, and it came in the form of tax evasion charges. It wasn't his bloody criminal activities or his violent reign that finally caught up with him, but rather the one thing that the government could track: money. Despite his attempts to hide his vast wealth, the IRS had gathered enough evidence to build a case against him. His arrest was the culmination of years of careful investigation, and when it finally came, it felt like a quiet and almost anticlimactic end to the reign of a man who had once made the world tremble. The road to prison was a stark contrast to the grandiosity of Capone's earlier days. Gone were the lavish parties, the power, and the respect. In their place, there was only the cold reality of a man who had lost everything. His time in prison would be a far cry from the high society he had once known. The big house was a place of isolation, where Capone, once surrounded by loyal henchmen and adoring fans, would now face the consequences of his actions. His health continued to deteriorate, exacerbated by the mental toll of his years in hiding, and his time in prison served as a grim reminder of the price of a life built on violence and corruption. Al Capone, the smiling psychopath who once ruled with an iron fist, was now a broken man, locked behind the walls of a prison that mirrored the cage he had built for himself. The legend of his empire had fallen apart, and the big house was the final chapter of a life that had once been synonymous with fear, power, and control. Alcatraz was not just any prison. It was the place where Capone's final transformation occurred, a cold and unyielding environment where the man who had once ruled Chicago with a calculated charm was reduced to a mere shadow of himself. Sent to the infamous island after his conviction, Capone found himself in a cell that would strip away the last of his power, his wealth, and his pride. The stone walls of Alcatraz were a far cry from the luxurious homes and penthouses he had once inhabited. The island was a fortress, an isolated place that seemed to amplify his fears, his loneliness, and his deepening sense of loss. The toll on Capone was immediate. Before his arrival, he had already been battling declining health, but Alcatraz took it to another level. The harsh conditions of the prison, its brutal isolation, and the constant surveillance wore him down in ways that were both physical and psychological. The very man who had once commanded entire neighborhoods now found himself at the mercy of guards, bound by rules he could no longer bend or break. His physical decline, coupled with the unbearable mental strain, accelerated rapidly. Capone, who had been a kingpin, was now reduced to a prisoner, isolated and powerless in a cell far from the streets of Chicago. Alcatraz was known for breaking men, and Capone was no exception. His once sharp mind, which had masterminded some of the most infamous crimes in American history, was now clouded by the pressure and the isolation. His mind deteriorated, a result of both his failing health and the constant torment of confinement. The man who had been feared and adored in equal measure was now losing the very thing that had made him formidable: his ability to think clearly. The man who had once controlled the city with a smile now struggled to maintain any sense of dignity. He could no longer count on the loyal henchmen or politicians who had once been his allies. They were gone, and he was left to face the consequences of his past actions alone. He tried to maintain a facade, but the isolation of Alcatraz stripped away any pretense. Capone, the man who had once been larger than life, was reduced to a shell of his former self. In the end, Alcatraz wasn't just a prison, it was a symbol of Capone's fall from grace. It was a place that took from him everything that had once made him powerful, leaving behind only the frailty of a man who had lived a life of excess and violence. His health deteriorated further, and the mental toll became unbearable. The man who had evaded capture for so long was finally trapped, not just by the walls of the prison, but by the weight of his own legacy. Alcatraz was where Capone's final chapter was written, not with the swagger and fearlessness of his past, but with the quiet resignation of a man whose empire had long since crumbled. Capone's fall from grace was as dramatic as his rise, though the latter was accompanied by power and wealth, and the former was marked by illness and isolation. His body, once a vessel of strength, was now betraying him, ravaged by syphilis that had long gone untreated. The disease, which had begun to eat away at his health years before, now took its toll in full force. It wasn't just his physical body that was breaking down. His mind, once sharp and calculating, began to deteriorate as well. The once feared mob boss, who had ruled over Chicago's streets with an iron fist, found himself fighting a battle he couldn't win against a disease that left him vulnerable and unable to control his criminal empire. Syphilis, a disease that attacks the central nervous system, slowly dismantled Capone's mental faculties, clouding his judgment and impairing his decision-making. The man who had once been able to manipulate the law, strike fear into his enemies, and charm those who had been loyal to him, now found himself struggling to focus, to strategize, and to maintain control. His mental decline mirrored the unraveling of his empire. As Capone became more and more disconnected from the world around him, his once thriving criminal operations started to falter. Rival gangs sensed the vulnerability and began picking away at his territory, exploiting his incapacity to lead. Inside Capone's mind, the clarity that once fueled his rise began to fade. At his peak, he had been known for his sharp intellect and meticulous planning, but now, those qualities were slipping through his fingers. His usual air of invincibility dissolved as his health worsened. He found himself increasingly distant from his empire, unable to make the strategic decisions that had once secured his dominance. His ability to strike fear into the hearts of rivals faded as he became more and more isolated. The power he had once commanded from his luxury homes and palatial estates was now reduced to the stark, sterile walls of prison cells and medical facilities. While Capone's body was decaying, so too was his control over the criminal network that had been built under his watch. No longer able to lead with the same iron fist, he watched as younger, more ambitious gangsters took the reins, claiming territory and siphoning off what was once his. His health continued to deteriorate at an alarming rate, both physically and mentally, and with it, so did his power. The once mighty king of the Chicago underworld was reduced to a sick man, unable to protect what he had fought so hard to build. Falling from grace was not just a matter of losing wealth or influence for Capone. It was a slow and painful unraveling of everything he had worked for, with each passing day marked by the reminder that he was no longer the unstoppable force he once was. The disease that had infected his body had, in many ways, already done the most damage, severing his connection to the empire he had built and leaving him to face the consequences of his unchecked past. As his empire crumbled and his health continued to spiral, Capone's fall from grace became inevitable, a tragic end to a life that had once seemed untouchable. In the final years of Al Capone's life, the man who had once dominated the streets of Chicago with an iron fist was reduced to a shell of his former self. Imprisoned at Alcatraz, Capone's mental and physical state deteriorated in ways that few could have imagined when he had once ruled with such brutal efficiency. The syphilis that had plagued him for so long now took full control, and his once sharp mind was slowly slipping away. His mental decline was evident to everyone around him. His memory faded, his speech became slurred, and his ability to make decisions or comprehend the world around him was all but gone. The great kingpin who had outsmarted law enforcement for so many years now found himself struggling to hold on to his past glory. Capone's legacy, once defined by fear, power, and wealth, began to crumble as his health deteriorated. In his prime, he had been feared by rivals and lawmen alike, controlling vast swaths of the city and making millions from illegal rackets. But now, as his mental faculties faded, so too did his grip on the criminal empire he had built. Capone's empire, still operating in Chicago but now fractured without his leadership, continued to run, but lacked the cohesion and iron will he had once brought to the table. The men who had once pledged loyalty to him now had to navigate a world without the man who had controlled it all. As his health declined, Capone retreated into his own thoughts. Unable to recognize the full extent of his fall from grace, the lavish parties and criminal scheming that once filled his days were replaced by long hours of isolation in his cell. The hospital wing of the prison became his home as he fought for his mental clarity, but with each passing day, it became clear that the world of organized crime, as well as his once great empire, was slipping away from him. Those who had once respected him now viewed him with pity. A once feared mobster reduced to a dying man who could no longer remember the world he had conquered. In his final days, Capone's health failed him entirely. His syphilis had advanced to the point where he could no longer function as he once had, and the once feared criminal mastermind who had dominated the underworld was left struggling to grasp the world around him. He was a shadow of the man who had once controlled everything, and as his mental state deteriorated, so did his legacy. The final days of Al Capone were not marked by power or respect, but by the tragedy of a man who had once been unstoppable, but was ultimately undone by his own illness. His death, when it finally came in 1947, was a somber end to a life that had once been defined by its chaos and grandeur. The empire he built may have crumbled, but the shadow of his legend lingered, a reminder of the price that even the most powerful must pay. After Al Capone's imprisonment, the empire he had carefully built over the years began to crumble. The once invincible mob boss, who had commanded the streets of Chicago with ruthless precision, was now behind bars, unable to guide the vast network of criminals he had once controlled. His absence left a vacuum in the underworld, and the gangs that had once answered to him began to fracture, with Capone no longer able to provide the leadership that had kept them united. His associates turned on one another, each hoping to claim a piece of the empire he had so fiercely protected. The redistribution of Capone's assets was a slow but inevitable process. Those who had been closest to him, including his trusted lieutenants, found themselves jockeying for position. Rival gangs, eager to expand their own territories, began to make their move. The once cohesive Chicago outfit splintered as smaller factions seized opportunities to take over lucrative bootlegging routes, gambling operations, and extortion rackets. The Italian-American crime syndicate, which had flourished under Capone's rule, was no longer the dominant force in the city. The fragmentation of Capone's operations allowed other criminal organizations, like the Genovese and Gambino families, to gain influence, extending their reach beyond Chicago. Capone's legendary wealth, once flowing freely into his hands, was now up for grabs. His many businesses, hidden assets, and cash reserves were raided by both law enforcement and ambitious criminals. His lavish homes and hidden vaults, once stocked with cash and valuables, were looted, often by former allies who now saw opportunity in his fall from power. Despite his previous efforts to keep his wealth and influence in check, the redistribution of these assets led to the rise of other crime bosses who inherited what Capone had worked so hard to build. At the same time, Capone's influence in Chicago's politics and law enforcement began to fade. For years, he had used bribes and intimidation to control the city's most powerful officials, ensuring that his empire remained untouchable. But with his incarceration, the political landscape changed. Capone's connections were no longer as valuable, and his rivals quickly moved in to replace him. The city that had once lived in fear of Capone's wrath now saw the emergence of new figures in the criminal world, men who learned from his mistakes and sought to carve out their own empires. The end of Capone's empire was a slow and inevitable process. What had once been a vast, unified criminal syndicate disintegrated under the weight of his absence and the aggressive pursuit of law enforcement. While Capone may have been the figurehead, it was the structure of organized crime itself that endured. His legacy, however, remained one of both caution and inspiration, a testament to the brief but unforgettable reign of the man who had once ruled Chicago with an iron fist. Even after Al Capone's death, his influence continued to cast a long shadow over Chicago and organized crime for years. The streets he once ruled were still haunted by his actions, and the criminal world he shaped carried on with a twisted reverence for his methods. Capone may have been gone, but the legacy of his empire persisted, not only in the underworld but in the very fabric of the city itself. Capone's rise to power had forever altered the structure of organized crime. His brutal tactics, strategic mind, and ability to manipulate both the criminal underworld and legitimate businesses became the template for future mobsters. His reign had proved that power could be built on fear, wealth, and a deep understanding of human nature. In the years after his death, many of the same strategies Capone had pioneered were used by the next generation of mafia leaders. The expansion of bootlegging, gambling, and loan sharking continued, even as law enforcement became more aggressive in their pursuit of organized crime. The Capone name became synonymous with both the glamour and violence of the mafia, and his actions served as a blueprint for anyone looking to make a mark in the criminal world. The mafia itself underwent changes in the wake of Capone's demise, but his influence was undeniable. The more sophisticated crime syndicates that emerged in his absence still operated with the same core principles Capone had utilized to dominate the city. His ability to form alliances, manage large networks, and maintain control over vast operations became the standard by which mafia bosses were measured. While Capone's empire fragmented after his arrest and incarceration, his name lived on in the legends and tales passed down through generations of criminals. The Italian-American mafia, in particular, continued to grow, and many of the most infamous crime families were inspired by the model Capone had established in Chicago. Capone's lasting impact also extended beyond the world of crime. His name became a fixture in American culture, a symbol of the intersection between wealth, power, and lawlessness. Books, films, and documentaries kept his story alive, immortalizing him as the quintessential gangster. His charisma, brutality, and the mythology surrounding his life made him an enduring figure in the collective imagination. In many ways, Capone had become a brand, a symbol not just of organized crime but of the American dream gone terribly wrong. The glamour and infamy of his life were romanticized, even as his darker legacy served as a cautionary tale. The Capone legacy also left a permanent mark on Chicago itself. The city had been transformed by his reign, its political structure and criminal enterprises shaped by his actions. Even as crime shifted and evolved, the influence of Capone could still be felt in the city's underworld. His empire may have crumbled, but the structures and power dynamics he created remained ingrained in the fabric of Chicago, a city forever connected to the rise and fall of the infamous Al Capone. Al Capone's rise to power wasn't just a story told in the shadows of Chicago's underworld. It was one that blazed across the front pages of newspapers, fueling the legend of the man who would become public enemy number one. The media, always hungry for a gripping story, gleefully fed the public's fascination with Capone, building him into a larger-than-life figure whose very name struck fear into the hearts of Americans. What started as a tale of a local mobster quickly evolved into a sensationalized myth, with each headline magnifying his ruthlessness and ambition. Capone's criminal persona was carefully sculpted, not only by his actions but by the press, who reveled in his flamboyance and disregard for the law. As he expanded his empire, committing murders, bombings, and widespread violence, the media latched onto every headline. Capone became the embodiment of lawlessness. His rise wasn't just about bootlegging or violence, it was a performance, and the press was complicit in broadcasting his every move to the public. His name became synonymous with the kind of swaggering villainy that captured the nation's imagination. He was no longer just a mob boss. He was a cultural icon, a man who wore the title of public enemy number one, like a badge of honor. The media didn't simply report on Capone, they created him. Stories about his lavish lifestyle, his generosity to the poor, and his ruthless tactics became intertwined, painting a complex image of a man who was both a philanthropist and a ruthless gangster. His ability to manipulate the press, combined with his notorious criminal acts, ensured that he was always in the public eye. This sensationalism made him a figure who was both admired and feared, a paradox that only added to his mystique. Capone's media-driven persona blurred the lines between fact and fiction. While he indeed lived a life marked by violence, greed, and manipulation, the public's perception was molded into something far greater than the reality. Stories of his kindness to the needy, his extravagant gifts, and his charm toward the media helped to craft an image of Capone that extended beyond mere criminality. He was a figure whose very existence seemed designed to be legendary, a man of power who would eventually meet his demise in a battle not just with law enforcement, but with the media machine he had helped build. By the time the government had targeted Capone, he was no longer just a gangster. He had become the embodiment of every fear and fascination that Americans had about organized crime. He was the villain who captured the public's attention, and in doing so, he became a symbol of the nation's struggles with prohibition, corruption, and lawlessness. The title of public enemy number one was not just bestowed upon him by authorities, it was a label that had been carved into the public consciousness by years of media-driven myth-making. And as Capone's empire crumbled, so did the myth that had been so carefully crafted around him. But the legend of Al Capone, built on sensationalism and media, would live on long after he was gone. Al Capone's rule over Chicago was not just an empire, it was a machine, meticulously crafted and ruthlessly maintained. His mafia was a well-oiled system, built on power, loyalty, and fear. The city was his domain, a place where his word was law, and his control extended from the streets to the corridors of power. Capone didn't just lead a criminal syndicate, he governed, dictated, and shaped the underworld with an iron fist, all while remaining untouchable by the authorities. At the heart of Capone's empire was a network of loyal soldiers and lieutenants who followed his commands without question. The structure of his organization mirrored that of a legitimate business, albeit one that trafficked in vice and violence. Capone was the CEO, the boss who made the decisions that dictated the flow of money, and his closest advisors were his inner circle, those who understood the complexities of running the mafia. They handled the day-to-day operations, bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and ensured that every part of Capone's empire functioned like clockwork. Each aspect of his business was a piece of the puzzle, and Capone ensured that none of the pieces moved without his approval. Beneath the surface, the mafia was a labyrinth of relationships and agreements, some made with money, others with blood. Capone's influence extended into every corner of Chicago's social and political life. He had judges, police officers, and politicians in his pocket, ensuring that his operations ran without interference. In return, he offered them protection, favors, and the assurance that their own transgressions would remain hidden. The streets of Chicago weren't just controlled by Capone's men, they were his. The police were often just as likely to be on his payroll as they were to be hunting him. Yet, Capone's rule was more than just violence and bribery. He was a master manipulator, able to sway the public with a combination of charm and philanthropy. He kept the support of the city's poor by funding community programs, handing out turkeys at Thanksgiving, and positioning himself as a figure who cared for the people. This public image was carefully cultivated, allowing him to operate in plain sight without drawing the full ire of the public. The contradiction between Capone's criminal activities and his philanthropic gestures made him a beloved figure to some, even as he was simultaneously terrorizing his enemies and consolidating power. Despite the glamour of his public persona, Capone's empire was built on fear. The men who worked for him knew that loyalty was key, but so was obedience. Disrespect or disloyalty could lead to a bullet in the back of the head or a body dumped in the river. The mafia wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a system of control, a way of life for those who lived under Capone's rule. He was the godfather, the man whose word was final, and those who crossed him never lived to regret it. Capone ruled not just by force, but by creating an atmosphere of inevitability, where the mafia's dominance seemed unstoppable. His name was synonymous with power, and his empire seemed as if it would last forever. But like all empires built on violence, it was fragile, and the cracks would eventually show. However, in those years of mob rule, Capone's influence was absolute, and his grip on Chicago was as unyielding as it was deadly. The streets of Chicago during Capone's reign were nothing short of a battlefield. The war for control of the city was fought with bloodshed, deception, and an unyielding thirst for power. Capone's empire wasn't the only one vying for dominance. The North Side Irish gang, led by the likes of George Bugs Moran, was one of the primary rivals that threatened Capone's rule. This feud would come to define much of Capone's criminal career, pushing him to employ increasingly brutal tactics to maintain his control. Capone understood that to rule Chicago, he had to eliminate his competition. The Irish gang, based on the North Side, had a stronghold in their own right, and Capone's rise to power wouldn't be complete until they were dismantled. What followed was a bloody war between the two factions, with Capone using his deep pockets and influence to keep the pressure on his rivals. But it wasn't just money that bought him loyalty, it was fear. Capone's reputation for violence was known far and wide, and he wasn't afraid to let the blood flow when it was necessary to assert dominance. The tactics Capone employed in his war against rival gangs were as ruthless as they were effective. He was known for using terror as a weapon, striking fast and hard, often without warning. Ambushes, drive-by shootings, and even bombings became part of his arsenal. One of the most infamous events during this time was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where Capone's men, disguised as police officers, gunned down 7 members of Moran's gang in cold blood. The sheer brutality of the massacre sent a chilling message to anyone who might dare challenge Capone's authority. But Capone's war didn't just play out in the shadows. It was a public spectacle, one that kept the citizens of Chicago on edge. As rival gangs fought for dominance, Capone's men would often clash in the streets, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. Yet, amidst the chaos, Capone remained a shadowy figure, never fully exposed to the law, always lurking behind the scenes, orchestrating the violence with a steady hand. His control over the city's streets came at a cost. The violence had a ripple effect, affecting both the lives of the average citizen and the stability of the city. But Capone's grip on power was so tight that even the most brazen acts of violence seemed to have little consequence for him. The police were often bought off, the politicians too afraid or too compromised to act, and Capone's empire grew ever stronger. In the end, Capone's war on the streets wasn't just a battle against rival gangs. It was a fight for his survival. And while his tactics were undeniably effective, they were also a reflection of his deep paranoia and his unrelenting desire to maintain control over his territory. Chicago's streets were his battlefield, and for a time, it seemed as though no one could ever challenge his rule. Capone's crime syndicate, known as the Outfit, was a tightly knit network of criminals that stretched across Chicago and beyond. It was a well-oiled machine, with every cog in its place, working together to generate an unimaginable flow of money, power, and influence. At the top of this hierarchy was Capone himself, the mastermind who controlled everything from his luxurious office to the dark alleys where his henchmen carried out his orders. He wasn't just a figurehead, he was the lifeblood of the outfit, orchestrating the operation with precision and cunning. The outfit wasn't built on loyalty to Capone alone, it was a mutual arrangement. In exchange for their loyalty, Capone made sure his lieutenants and henchmen were well compensated, well protected, and feared. Some of the most loyal men in Capone's organization were his inner circle, men like Frank the Enforcer, Nitti, who handled much of the day-to-day operations and kept the street soldiers in line. Joe, the boss, Aiello, who controlled various criminal rackets, and Johnny the Fox, Torrio, the man who first brought Capone into the fold and served as his mentor. These men were more than just accomplices. They were family in Capone's eyes, and they ensured that every aspect of the outfit was carried out with ruthless efficiency. The lieutenants and capos within the outfit handled everything from the illegal alcohol trade, gambling, and prostitution to protection rackets, labor unions, and political bribery. They were the ones who carried out Capone's orders on the streets, ensuring his empire ran smoothly. They were often seen as untouchable, with their loyalty to Capone granting them access to a life of luxury, complete with fancy cars, expensive clothes, and an ever-growing bankroll. In return, they kept the streets of Chicago under Capone's control, striking fear into anyone who dared defy him. The men who worked for Capone were as varied as the criminal enterprises they managed, but what bound them together was an unspoken understanding of the code. Silence was golden in the world of organized crime, and disloyalty was the highest sin. The outfit operated as a family, with each member knowing their place and their responsibilities. Betrayal was met with swift retribution, often fatal. Capone's enforcers were known for their brutal efficiency, never hesitating to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to the empire. It was this atmosphere of fear and loyalty that allowed the outfit to thrive in the lawless world of Chicago. But even as the outfit grew in power, it was clear that the organization was as much a product of Capone's personality as it was a criminal enterprise. His magnetic charisma and calculating intelligence held the organization together. He understood that loyalty was not given freely, and he used his charm, his violence, and his wealth to ensure that the men beneath him remained devoted to him. In a world ruled by crime, Capone's outfit was the epitome of order and power. Capone's rise to power was not just a result of his own criminal prowess. It was made possible by a vast network of connections that extended deep into Chicago's political, business, and law enforcement circles. The symbiotic relationship between Capone and these powerful figures created an environment where corruption ran rampant, allowing him to operate with near impunity. His ability to grease the wheels of power ensured that he wasn't just a feared gangster. He was also a man whose influence touched nearly every corner of society. At the heart of Capone's underworld connections were the politicians who helped keep him above the law. He knew that to control the streets of Chicago, he needed to control the people in power. Through bribery and intimidation, Capone formed alliances with key political figures, including ward bosses, aldermen, and even the mayor's office. These politicians turned a blind eye to his activities, ensuring that the police would look the other way when it came to his bootlegging operations, gambling dens, and other criminal enterprises. In return, Capone funded their campaigns, offered donations, and provided a network of loyal supporters who could help secure votes or sway public opinion. Capone's ties to businessmen further solidified his grip on Chicago. He didn't just control the illegal enterprises, he also infiltrated legitimate businesses. With his connections, he was able to ensure that many of his criminal operations ran seamlessly alongside the city's thriving economy. His influence extended to bars, clubs, and even the city's construction industry, where he ensured his people were on the payroll. Business owners who refused to cooperate found themselves at the mercy of Capone's enforcers, and many soon realized that it was easier to pay for protection than to fight a battle they couldn't win. Equally important were Capone's dealings with law enforcement. While many officers remained honest, the vast majority were either on his payroll or too intimidated to go after him. He had a knack for finding and exploiting weak links in the system, paying off judges, detectives, and even police commissioners to ensure that his operations ran smoothly. It was not unusual for Capone to receive early warnings about police raids or investigations, allowing him to cover his tracks before any serious action could be taken. This network of corrupt officials acted as Capone's personal shield, allowing him to operate in broad daylight without the fear of arrest or conviction. Through these connections, Capone built an empire that was far more than just a criminal syndicate. It was a system that intertwined crime and legitimate business, feeding off each other in a cycle of power, money, and influence. The widespread corruption that allowed Capone to thrive was not just a Chicago problem. It was a reflection of the deep rot that could be found in many American cities during Prohibition. Capone knew that to keep his empire intact, he needed more than just muscle. He needed an entire network of people who could make sure the system worked in his favor. And with that network in place, Capone became untouchable, the puppet master pulling the strings of a corrupt city. Under Capone's leadership, the Chicago outfit transformed from a small, loosely organized group into one of the most powerful and feared criminal syndicates in America. Capone understood early on that the key to running a successful crime empire was structure and loyalty, two elements that would become the backbone of the outfit. As he expanded his influence, Capone meticulously built a network of loyal lieutenants, enforcers, and allies, each of whom had their specific roles to play in ensuring the organization ran like a well-oiled machine. What began as a local crime family, primarily involved in bootlegging and gambling, quickly evolved into a multifaceted operation that spanned across the country. The outfit's rise coincided with the turbulence of Prohibition, a time when the demand for illegal alcohol was at its peak. With Capone at the helm, the Chicago outfit controlled the majority of the alcohol trade in the city, and by extension, much of the Midwest. Capone's savvy in bootlegging allowed him to dominate this profitable business, using violence, bribery, and his connections with corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials to ensure that his rivals were either neutralized or driven out. In a city rife with corruption, Capone proved himself to be a master strategist, always one step ahead of his enemies. The outfit's influence didn't stop at alcohol. Capone expanded into a range of illegal activities, from gambling and prostitution to labor racketeering. He understood the importance of diversifying his criminal portfolio, ensuring that the outfit was involved in nearly every profitable vice in Chicago. As the organization's reach grew, so too did its power. Capone was no longer just a local gangster. He became the figurehead of a nationwide criminal syndicate. The outfit's operations extended to other cities, with branches set up in New York, Detroit, and beyond, making it one of the most formidable crime organizations in the United States. Central to the outfit's rise was Capone's ability to maintain control. While he allowed his men to run operations, he kept the reins tightly in his hands. Loyalty was paramount in Capone's world, and betrayal was punished harshly. He cultivated a reputation for both generosity and ruthlessness, making sure his associates were well taken care of, but ensuring that anyone who crossed him or threatened the outfit's operations faced brutal consequences. His power was so vast that even those in the highest circles of society feared him, and his ability to manipulate the public's perception made him an untouchable figure for much of his reign. As the outfit's influence grew, so did its reputation. Capone became a household name, synonymous with crime and power. But it wasn't just the fear that he instilled that made the outfit so formidable. It was the way he had built an empire that was both feared and respected. He knew the value of controlling the streets, the city, and the narrative, and under his leadership, the Chicago outfit became a symbol of both corruption and power. leaving a legacy that would continue to haunt the American criminal landscape long after Capone's downfall. As Capone's power grew, so did his fame, and with it, a public persona that managed to straddle the line between admiration and fear. To the public, Capone was more than just a criminal mastermind. He was a larger-than-life figure, a symbol of the American dream gone wrong. His charm was undeniable. He knew how to work a room, flashing his infamous smile, always ready with a handshake or a witty quip. His charisma allowed him to present a version of himself that was both approachable and powerful, a rare blend that won him admiration in certain circles and shielded him from the harshest of public scrutiny. In the eyes of many, Capone was more than a gangster. He was a self-made man, a success story born of grit and resilience. Yet, beneath the charm and smooth exterior lay a ruthless killer, a man who built his empire on the backs of those he destroyed. Capone's public image, one of a benevolent businessman and philanthropist, was a carefully crafted mask designed to distract from the bloody reality of his criminal dealings. He was known for his generous donations to charity, especially during the Great Depression, when he funded soup kitchens and handed out turkeys to the needy. To the poor and downtrodden of Chicago, Capone wasn't just a gangster. He was a protector, someone who provided for them when the city's legitimate leaders could not. But these acts of kindness were part of his calculated strategy. By winning over the hearts of the public, he ensured that law enforcement would have a harder time bringing him down. Capone knew that loyalty from the streets could translate into power, and as long as the people saw him as a benefactor, they were less likely to turn against him. He also used the press to his advantage, understanding the media's thirst for sensational stories. His dealings with reporters and photographers allowed him to control how the world viewed him. When he wasn't outgunning rival gangs or running illegal operations, he was often seen in the company of politicians, businessmen, and celebrities, further reinforcing the image of Capone as a man of influence. This public persona, however, was built on contradictions. For every charitable act he performed, there were countless murders, violent turf wars, and bribes to politicians and police officers. The same man who donated money to hospitals was the same man who ran gambling racks and controlled the bootlegging trade, bringing death and destruction to anyone who dared oppose him. Yet, the public largely chose to look the other way. They bought into the myth of the charming gangster, the man who could do no wrong as long as he kept a smile on his face. In time, Capone became a symbol not just of crime, but of the country's conflicted relationship with morality and power. His fame, intertwined with his infamy, made him the subject of both admiration and fear. But as his empire continued to grow, the line between the man he was and the myth he had become began to blur, leaving a legacy that would haunt both the streets of Chicago and the American public for years to come. Johnny Torrio had always been the mastermind behind the operations that laid the foundation for what would become Capone's empire. Torrio's influence shaped Capone, guiding him through the world of organized crime with a steady hand. But as the years passed, the strain of leadership began to wear on Torrio, and a fateful day came when he decided to step down, leaving the reins of the empire in Capone's hands. Torrio had been through it all, from the Prohibition-era bootlegging to the bloody gang wars that had plagued Chicago. But a failed assassination attempt in early 1925, where Torrio was left wounded but alive, changed everything. It was a wake-up call that left him questioning his future in the violent world of organized crime. Realizing the dangers of his position and feeling the weight of his years, Torrio decided it was time to hand over the business to Capone, the ambitious and ruthless protege who had proven himself capable of handling the brutality of the streets. Capone had spent years learning from Torrio, watching the older man's careful maneuvering through the treacherous world of Chicago's gangs. He had gained the respect and loyalty of Torrio's key men, and now, with his mentor stepping aside, it was Capone's turn to run the show. Torrio's decision to step down wasn't just a personal retreat, but a calculated move to protect both himself and the organization. He knew that Capone's rise to power was inevitable, and he believed that the younger man, though fierce and unpredictable, had the ability to solidify the empire Torrio had worked so hard to build. With Torrio out of the picture, Capone wasted no time in asserting his control over the organization. He swiftly took charge of the operations, expanding the outfit's territory and influence across Chicago. The transition wasn't without challenges, however. Torrio's absence left a power vacuum that was filled with tension and bloodshed. Rival factions, sensing an opportunity, tried to test Capone's resolve. But Capone, who had long been known for his brutal methods, quickly eliminated any threats to his reign. Capone's leadership was marked by an iron fist and a fierce desire to maintain control. His approach to the business was far more violent and direct than Torrio's more cautious methods. Capone didn't hesitate to use murder, intimidation, and bribery to ensure loyalty and eliminate any opposition. The bloodshed that had been a part of Torrio's reign only intensified under Capone's rule, as the new boss fought to establish his dominance. In the wake of Torrio's departure, Capone's criminal empire flourished. He expanded into new territories, solidified alliances with corrupt politicians and law enforcement, and built a network of loyal associates who helped him maintain control over Chicago. Torrio, meanwhile, retired to a quieter life, living under the protection of Capone's network. Though he would never fully sever ties with the outfit, his role in the criminal world diminished as Capone's power skyrocketed. For Capone, the fall of Johnny Torrio was not just the end of an era, but the beginning of his own reign. The criminal empire he inherited would become one of the most feared and influential in American history, and Torrio's decision to step down allowed Capone to step into the spotlight, where he would solidify his place as the king of Chicago's underworld. The battle for control of Chicago's criminal underworld was one marked by violence, bloodshed, and a ruthless determination to dominate. With Capone now at the helm of the outfit, the city became a battlefield where rival gangs vied for supremacy, each striving to carve out their share of power and territory. The most prominent adversaries were the North Side Irish Gang, led by the likes of George "Bugs" Moran, who had been Capone's main rival since the early days of his rise. The war between them was personal and fierce, as both sides sought to gain control over bootlegging operations, gambling dens, and other illicit businesses that were the lifeblood of the city's underworld. Capone's approach to the battle for control was simple: eliminate all threats and consolidate his power. He relied on terror, murder, and the strategic manipulation of key figures in the city. His ability to quickly and decisively deal with those who posed a challenge was one of the cornerstones of his success. Capone's forces, made up of his most loyal lieutenants, wreaked havoc on their enemies, using tactics that left no room for negotiation or mercy. The streets ran red with blood, as Capone's men and his rivals fought for dominance. It wasn't just about control over territory. It was about sending a message, about showing who truly held the power. One of the most notorious episodes in this war for control was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On February 14, 1929, Capone's men, disguised as police officers, lined up 7 members of the Moran gang against a wall and executed them in cold blood. The brutal efficiency of the attack sent shockwaves through the underworld and sent a clear message: Capone was untouchable. His enemies trembled at the sight of such raw violence, knowing that Capone would stop at nothing to solidify his dominance. Moran, who narrowly escaped the massacre, was left to watch as his gang crumbled and Capone's empire grew even stronger. Despite Capone's brutal tactics, his reign was not without challenges. Rival gangs continued to rise, each attempting to take a piece of the pie, and even those within Capone's own ranks occasionally turned against him. But Capone had learned from the best, and he knew that loyalty had to be rewarded with fear. He carefully crafted alliances when necessary, but always maintained the upper hand by ensuring that no one was ever truly safe from his wrath. Those who betrayed him paid with their lives, and his reputation as a kingpin who could not be dethroned became legend. As Capone's control over Chicago grew, so did the bloodshed. Each day brought a new battle for territory, and each victory brought Capone one step closer to becoming the most powerful mob boss the city had ever seen. But the war for control, while it seemed to end with Capone's ascension, was far from over. It was a war that would leave scars on the city, a legacy of fear and destruction that would haunt Chicago for years to come. To the public, Al Capone was both a larger-than-life figure and a paradox. On the surface, he was a charming businessman, a philanthropist, and even a celebrity. His face appeared in newspapers not only as a criminal mastermind but also as a benefactor to the people of Chicago. Capone understood the power of public perception and, through a carefully crafted image, presented himself as a man of the people, a hero to the downtrodden. He was known to donate to charities, fund local community projects, and provide financial support to the families of police officers who had been killed in the line of duty. These acts of kindness were often trumpeted in the press, painting him as a Robin Hood figure. Even though his wealth was built on the blood and suffering of countless victims, Capone knew that while his criminal empire grew on the streets of Chicago, his public image would serve as a shield from the law. The media, always hungry for sensational stories, helped cultivate this myth of Capone as both a ruthless mob boss and a benevolent, business-savvy entrepreneur. Newspapers frequently covered his donations to hospitals and the opening of soup kitchens, and his social appearances at events like the annual Capone's Night added to his allure as a charming, approachable man. In a city plagued by poverty and the effects of prohibition, many saw him as a figure who, despite his violent ways, was making the lives of the common people better. The media, with its endless thirst for scandal and drama, was complicit in shaping this dual image. Reporters, often more interested in selling papers than reporting facts, capitalized on Capone's charisma and his notorious criminal activities. They frequently blurred the lines between his philanthropy and his crimes, portraying him as a man whose business empire, whether it was running illegal alcohol or gambling rings, was just another form of industry, much like any other businessman of the time. His dealings, though illicit, were framed as part of the city's pulse, something people could relate to, even admire. Capone was both feared and admired, and that made him a story worth telling. However, beneath this carefully constructed public facade, Capone was a man of unimaginable cruelty. His operations were violent, ruthless, and designed to instill terror in both his enemies and his own allies. He bribed politicians, intimidated law enforcement, and made millions through illegal activities that destroyed countless lives. But to the people, these acts were overshadowed by the stories of the man who paid for funerals, funded local businesses, and walked among them without an air of arrogance. In his own mind, Capone reveled in the public's admiration, knowing that his criminal empire flourished in part because of the public's inability or unwillingness to see the reality beneath his smile. In the end, the public's perception of Capone remained a carefully crafted illusion, thanks to the media's willing complicity in promoting him as a philanthropist while hiding the bloodstains of his real empire. The image of Capone as a businessman and benefactor was far more palatable than the truth of his life as a violent, power-hungry criminal. This contrast between perception and reality would ultimately become a key element of Capone's legacy, as people continued to debate whether he was a villain or a misunderstood hero. When Capone arrived in Chicago, the city was a battleground, a place where power was dictated by violence, betrayal, and the ability to control the flow of money. He was determined not just to survive, but to thrive, and his first strategic move was to gain control over the South Side, a key area that was teeming with opportunity for a man like him. At the time, the South Side was divided among rival factions, each vying for control of the lucrative bootlegging operations that Prohibition had created. Capone, with his sharp mind and ruthless drive, quickly recognized that this was a place where he could establish dominance. His rise to power was not one marked by subtlety. Capone did not shy away from the violence necessary to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. Rivals who had once controlled portions of the South Side were either eliminated or forced to kneel before him. Capone's method was simple: get rid of the competition, buy off key figures, and make the people under his thumb believe that working for him was not just profitable but essential for their survival. The South Side became Capone's proving ground, where every murder, every act of aggression, was a message to others who dared challenge his authority. Capone's approach was both calculated and brutal. He targeted the most influential figures in rival gangs, using an efficient combination of assassination, intimidation, and manipulation to break their wills. He didn't just kill for the sake of bloodshed, he killed for power. By eliminating a rival, he solidified his own control, making it clear that the South Side was now his territory. His enforcers, often dispatched with the same cold precision as Capone himself, were tasked with making sure no one dared to rise against him again. But Capone's violence was not the only tool at his disposal. He had a keen understanding of how to maintain control through fear and loyalty. Once his enemies were dealt with, Capone quickly moved to secure the loyalty of those who remained. He made sure to reward those who worked for him, offering protection and wealth, while ensuring those who even considered betraying him knew the consequences. Loyalty was paid for in blood, and Capone ensured that no one who worked for him ever forgot that. Through his aggressive tactics, Capone managed to secure a stranglehold over the South Side, and from there, he began to expand his reach. His criminal empire grew exponentially, now encompassing bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and the protection rackets that powered Chicago's underworld. Each move Capone made, each elimination of a rival, pushed him closer to his goal: absolute control. His rule was solidified by his ability to make the city bow before him, through fear, money, and the unyielding grip of his ruthless ambition. It wasn't just a fight for territory anymore, it was a fight for a throne, and Capone, with blood on his hands, was ready to claim it. Al Capone's wealth was as legendary as his rise to power. The money poured in from all corners of Chicago, flowing through his many illicit enterprises, each one more profitable than the last. His bootlegging operations alone, which thrived during Prohibition, made him a fortune. But Capone didn't just stop at alcohol, he expanded into gambling, prostitution, and extortion, all of which contributed to an empire that was practically unstoppable. The cash flowed like a river, and Capone reveled in the power it gave him. He didn't just collect money, he flaunted it. Capone's lifestyle became a symbol of his dominance. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a king, and his wealth was his crown. His home on the South Side of Chicago, a lavish mansion with walls that could tell countless stories of excess, became the centerpiece of his empire. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a fortress, a symbol of what he had accomplished. The furnishings were rich, the art was extravagant, and the parties that raged inside were the stuff of legends. A man like Capone didn't just own a house, he created a palace, complete with all the trimmings that spoke to his success. But Capone wasn't just about enjoying his wealth for personal gain. He used his money to buy loyalty, to silence enemies, and to ensure that he remained untouchable. He knew that money could grease the wheels of influence, whether that meant bribing politicians, law enforcement, or anyone who might pose a threat to his empire. His financial dealings were just as meticulous as his criminal operations. Every dollar spent was a strategic move, whether it was invested in building his criminal empire or used to maintain his lavish lifestyle. Despite his vast fortune, Capone wasn't shy about showing off. He believed in living life to the fullest, and that meant surrounding himself with the best of everything. Expensive cars, fine clothes, and rare liquor filled his life to the brim. He traveled in style, throwing lavish parties that attracted celebrities and high society, all while carefully maintaining the illusion that he was just a successful businessman. His image was as important as his wealth, and he was a master at crafting it to suit his needs. Capone understood that the more he flaunted his wealth, the more untouchable he became. But as much as he enjoyed the fruits of his empire, Capone's wealth was also a double-edged sword. It was a constant reminder of how far he had come, but it also attracted attention from both law enforcement and rivals who sought to take him down. In the end, his wealth wasn't just a symbol of success, it was a beacon, drawing in those who wanted to take it away from him. Al Capone's reputation for brutality was not just a product of the violence that punctuated his rise to power, it was the foundation of his rule. He knew that in the world he inhabited, power was not merely about money, it was about fear. And fear, he understood better than anyone, was best instilled through swift, ruthless action. Capone's methods for dealing with his enemies were brutal and unrelenting, designed to send a message that no one would dare challenge his dominance. In his world, weakness was a death sentence, and mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. Executions were common in Capone's criminal empire. Those who crossed him, whether they were rivals, traitors, or anyone who posed a threat, didn't just disappear into obscurity. They were made examples of. Capone had no qualms about ordering executions in broad daylight, using the most violent means possible to send a chilling message to anyone who might be watching. Often, he didn't even need to pull the trigger himself. His loyal henchmen, his soldiers, carried out the dirty work without hesitation. The bloodshed was just another tool in Capone's arsenal, and he wielded it with precision. Perhaps the most infamous of his violent tactics were the bombings, particularly the use of car bombs and dynamite to eliminate enemies. It wasn't just about taking out a rival, it was about creating chaos and fear, forcing his enemies to live in constant dread that their time was up. Capone understood that bombings were effective because they didn't just kill, they maimed, they destroyed, they left people shaken to their core. The very idea that anyone could be blown apart at any moment kept the streets of Chicago in a state of fear, a fear that served Capone's interests well. Violence was never Capone's first choice, but he knew that it was the only language some people understood. When his rivals grew too powerful or too vocal, he didn't hesitate to eliminate them permanently. This was not a world of second chances. This was a world where a misstep meant your life. And Capone, in his cold, calculating manner, used murder as a tool to preserve his empire and maintain his reign over Chicago's criminal underworld. The constant threat of violence ensured loyalty, and it made Capone untouchable in the eyes of many. It wasn't just his money or his charm that made him feared, it was the certainty that to cross him meant facing death, often in the most horrific of ways. Capone's reliance on violence also kept him on top, in a city where power shifted quickly. In the cutthroat world of organized crime, control wasn't just about money or influence. It was about the ability to enforce your will, and Capone's willingness to use murder as a means of control ensured that his empire remained firmly in his grasp. In a sense, Capone became not just a man, but an embodiment of fear itself, a figure whose very presence sent waves of terror through the city. His name was spoken with both reverence and dread, and for anyone who dared oppose him, the consequences were swift, certain, and often lethal. Al Capone's rise to power was not just the result of his own efforts, it was also shaped by the network of connections within his family. The Capones, born into the tough streets of Brooklyn, were more than just relatives. They were collaborators in the underworld, key players in his empire. Al's deep sense of loyalty to his family was undeniable, but it was also his greatest weakness. His brothers, cousins, and even his mother became integral parts of his operations, whether through business dealings, connections, or providing emotional support. However, this deep familial bond was a double-edged sword. While it offered Capone an unmatched level of trust within his inner circle, it also created vulnerabilities that could easily be exploited. Capone's brother, James, was perhaps his closest ally, managing some of the more sensitive aspects of his business. He was involved in various criminal activities, including smuggling and the operation of speakeasies. His role allowed Al to focus on the more public aspects of his empire, while knowing his family members were running things behind the scenes. But it wasn't just about business. Al's relationship with his mother, Teresa, was complex. She was a steadying influence in his life, but her presence also kept Al tethered to a softer side, a side that couldn't help but occasionally show compassion or restraint. Teresa's support was vital, especially when the law closed in on her son, but in some ways, she also became a liability, making Capone's criminal activities more difficult to hide. Despite the loyalty of his family, Capone was constantly aware of how his empire was becoming more fragile with their involvement. As much as he needed them, he also knew that family connections in the criminal world could lead to betrayal. And the tighter the circle, the more risk there was of someone slipping up. His brother, for instance, was often too close to Al, and their shared interests could sometimes put both men at risk. Capone's life was one of constant maneuvering, and he had to protect his family not just from law enforcement, but from the danger of their own ambitions or weaknesses. Family loyalty in Capone's world wasn't just about support, it was about power. His relatives were his eyes and ears, his spies, and, when needed, his muscle. But when the law began closing in, and the stakes grew higher, the bonds of blood became a potential trap. While they could be relied upon in times of need, family also posed a risk. As Capone's empire began to crumble, it wasn't just the law that sought to bring him down, it was the very people he trusted the most. The people who knew him best were often the ones with the most to lose. And with the weight of his criminal activities growing, Capone's family, once a strength, had the potential to become his undoing. Al Capone's battle with the federal authorities was one of the most intense legal and political struggles in American history. For years, he had been untouchable, his reign over Chicago's underworld unchallenged by the police or local law enforcement. But the federal government, determined to break his grip on the city and its criminal economy, decided to take a different route, one that didn't rely on the violence Capone was so adept at using to his advantage. The feds were not concerned with the bodies in the streets or the rackets that lined Capone's pockets. What they saw as the real opportunity for his downfall lay in something far more insidious: tax evasion. The authorities had long suspected that Capone's wealth, which flowed like a river of blood money through his empire, was built on a foundation of illegal activities. Yet, they were never able to pin him down for any of the murders, bootlegging operations, or even bribery schemes that allowed him to thrive. But the law had one weapon they could use against him: taxes. Capone had built a massive fortune through illegal means, and yet, in a country where even the most ruthless were forced to pay their dues to Uncle Sam, Capone's refusal to pay taxes was his greatest vulnerability. The feds, led by agents like Elliot Ness, began to turn their attention to Capone's financial records. They knew that in order to take him down, they needed proof that he was living far beyond what could be accounted for by legitimate means. What they had lacked in evidence of his more violent crimes, they hoped to make up for with something simpler: numbers. The Internal Revenue Service, IRS, was tasked with investigating Capone's financials, and they began to dig deep. Every expense, every transaction, every bank deposit was scrutinized with the intent to find something, anything, that could serve as a basis for indictment. But Capone was no fool. He had surrounded himself with accountants and experts who knew how to hide illicit profits behind layers of legitimate business fronts, making it nearly impossible to trace any significant earnings back to him. But the feds, relentless in their pursuit, finally found the crack in his armor. They could show that Capone had earned far more than he had reported to the government, and more importantly, they could show he had willfully evaded paying taxes on his ill-gotten wealth. It was a slow burn, but once they started unraveling his finances, it was clear that Capone had been living a double life. one that defied not only the law but the very system that had built the nation. As the case against him mounted, Capone became increasingly paranoid. He knew the law was closing in, but his ability to manipulate the system and buy influence had kept him one step ahead for so long that he couldn't fathom being caught. The more the feds dug, the more desperate he became, trying to use intimidation and bribes to silence those who might testify against him. But in the end, it wasn't his ruthless tactics that brought him down. It was the relentless pursuit of the government, using its own weapons of law and finance to take down one of the most powerful and feared criminals in American history. As Capone's empire grew, so too did the shadows that loomed over it, and with each passing day, those shadows began to erode his mind. The violence, the betrayals, the constant threat of being brought down, it all began to weigh heavily on him. The man who had once been the embodiment of confidence and control now found himself tormented by the very things he had built. The fear of losing his grip on power, the fear of being caught, and the fear of being consumed by the same world he had conquered. The paranoia was slow at first, a whisper in the back of his mind that no one could truly be trusted, not even those closest to him. But as the feds closed in and rival gangs made their moves, that whisper grew louder until it was all-consuming. Every knock on the door, every unexpected phone call, every unfamiliar face in the crowd became a potential threat. Capone, once fearless and commanding, started seeing enemies everywhere. He stopped sleeping soundly, waking at odd hours, convinced that his empire was about to crumble at any moment. The walls, both literal and figurative, began closing in around him. He had always been ruthless in his dealings, cutting down anyone who posed a threat to his reign. But now, he began to view even his most loyal men as liabilities. Friends became foes in his eyes, and allies who had once stood by him in the fiercest of battles were now suspects, people who might betray him for a price or in a moment of weakness. He surrounded himself with even more guards, grew more secretive, and became increasingly isolated. His behavior became erratic, driven by the belief that anyone could be the one to bring him down. He lived in constant fear of being betrayed, of his secrets being exposed to the public, of the feds getting too close to the truth. The man who had once been the most feared and respected figure in Chicago now couldn't trust anyone, not even his own shadow. The toll of the constant paranoia began to eat away at him. His physical health deteriorated, and his once sharp mind became clouded by the weight of his own thoughts. He became withdrawn, even from his family, spending most of his time in his many safe houses, pacing, plotting, and stewing in his own anxiety. The empire he had built, with blood and gold, was starting to crumble from within, not from the law or his rivals, but from the very man who had once ruled it all with an iron fist. Capone's descent into paranoia was the inevitable byproduct of his ruthless pursuit of power. The very empire that had made him feared by many had also made him a prisoner of his own mind, trapped in a constant state of fear, always looking over his shoulder, always anticipating the worst. In the end, it wasn't the law that brought Capone down. It wasn't the rival gangs or the betrayals that ultimately finished him off. It was the slow, insidious collapse of his own mind, a mind that had once ruled the underworld, but could no longer escape the grip of fear it had created. In the final years of his empire, Capone found himself facing an enemy far more persistent than any rival gang or corrupt official: time. The once unstoppable force in Chicago, the man who had controlled the streets with an iron grip, was now a shadow of himself, desperately trying to maintain the power he had once wielded so effortlessly. His empire, once vast and untouchable, was crumbling around him, piece by piece, as the federal government closed in and rival criminals began to circle, sensing the blood in the water. But Capone wasn't one to surrender easily. Even as the weight of his criminal activities bore down on him, he refused to let go of the reins. His mind, though increasingly clouded by paranoia and illness, was still sharp enough to know that if he was going to go down, it wouldn't be without a fight. So, he began to fight back in every way he could. He doubled down on his operations, trying to keep his empire running, while at the same time taking greater precautions. Safe houses, secret meetings, false identities. Capone tried it all. But the world had changed, and his tactics, once so effective, were no longer enough. The feds, under the guidance of a relentless group of agents, including those from the Treasury Department, had made significant progress. They began to close in on Capone, using every trick in the book to get him on charges, particularly the one that had eluded them for so long: tax evasion. Despite all his attempts to launder money through various channels and hide his wealth under layers of deception, the feds were unrelenting. They found the cracks in his empire, and they started to exploit them. Capone's last stand wasn't one of blazing guns or violent showdowns with rival gangs. Instead, it was a battle of wit and survival. As the pressure mounted, he tried to strike back, reaching out to his old network of politicians, lawyers, and allies, hoping to buy his way out, or at least delay the inevitable. He paid off contacts in the government, desperately seeking any loophole that would give him time to regroup, time to fight back, time to retain his grip on the empire he had built. But the world had changed, and Capone was running out of moves. His health, already in decline due to his syphilis, only worsened as the stress of his situation wore on him. His paranoia deepened, and his once vibrant public persona became a distant memory. He wasn't the smiling gangster anymore. Now, he was a man at war with the clock, trying desperately to stay ahead of the law. But knowing that his time was running out, he continued to manipulate, bribe, and scheme, but nothing seemed to work. The federal government was relentless, and Capone's empire, built on fear and blood, was slowly suffocating under the weight of its own corruption. In the end, Capone's last stand wasn't one of glory or triumph. It was the desperate, frantic efforts of a man who had spent his life building an empire, only to watch it all slip through his fingers. He had fought fiercely, but it became clear that the end was near. The last remnants of his empire, once untouchable, were beginning to crumble, and there was nothing Capone could do to stop it. After years of evading the law, Al Capone's reign finally came to an end, not through a dramatic shootout or a violent clash with his rivals, but through the relentless persistence of law enforcement. For all his power, his wealth, and his cunning, it wasn't his criminal acts of bootlegging, murder, or bribery that finally brought him down. It was something far less glamorous, something he had thought he could avoid for years: taxes. The federal government had spent years chasing Capone, trying to pin him down for something, anything, that would stick. His empire had been built on a bedrock of violence, fear, and corruption, and yet it was something as mundane as unpaid taxes that would ultimately bring it all crashing down. Capone had lived a life in the shadows, operating in the murky world of organized crime, but his ability to hide his wealth through layers of deception was his undoing. The feds, spearheaded by the newly formed special unit focusing on financial crimes, were closing in, finally finding a weakness in his vast network of money laundering operations. Capone had become increasingly paranoid, his mental state deteriorating as the pressure mounted. For a man who had once ruled with an iron fist, the realization that his fall would come not from a rival gang or a police bullet, but from something so far removed from the violence he knew so well, was too much to bear. The government, led by the determined Elliot Ness and his team of untouchables, had spent years gathering evidence, and they knew that the key to breaking Capone lay in his finances. Using intelligence, meticulous audits, and covert operations, they were able to piece together enough evidence to charge him with tax evasion. It was a tactic that had never before been used so effectively against such a high-profile figure, and it worked. On the day of his arrest, Capone wasn't facing a dramatic bust with guns blazing. Instead, he was apprehended quietly, taken into custody in a manner that reflected the meticulous nature of the case against him. There was no grand fight, no resistance from the man who had once been untouchable. He was arrested in 1931, charged with multiple counts of tax evasion. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The gangster who had once controlled an empire of vice, blood, and fear was now facing the law not for murder or bootlegging, but for something so simple, yet so damning: taxes. The aftermath of Capone's arrest marked the end of an era in Chicago's criminal world. His empire, once feared and revered, collapsed almost overnight. Capone's influence shriveled in the face of his conviction. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, marking the end of his stranglehold on the city and the beginning of his downfall. Though he would continue to try and operate from prison, his ability to control his empire had all but vanished. The great Al Capone, once a king of Chicago, was now just another prisoner, broken by the very system he had once defied so effortlessly. The great arrest had come not at the hands of guns or bombs, but through the quiet persistence of law enforcement, proving that even the most powerful men are not above the law. Capone's time in prison marked the beginning of his slow, agonizing decline. Once a man who had commanded entire streets and ruled over one of the most feared criminal empires in history, he now found himself confined to the cold, unforgiving walls of a federal penitentiary. His physical and mental health, once formidable, began to erode in the harsh conditions of the prison system. The man who had been untouchable, who had once moved through life with an iron will, was now reduced to a mere shadow of his former self. Sentenced to 11 years for tax evasion, Capone spent his early years in several prisons, but it was his transfer to the infamous Alcatraz Island in 1934 that would define his downfall. Known for housing the most dangerous criminals, Alcatraz was as much a psychological torment as it was a physical one. Isolated from the world and surrounded by the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, Capone's empire felt 1,000 miles away. It wasn't just the harsh conditions that affected him, but the fact that he could no longer control anything. The grandiose figure of Capone, who once had the entire city of Chicago under his thumb, was now confined to a tiny prison cell, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his influence. His health began to rapidly deteriorate during his time at Alcatraz. The syphilis that had been eating away at his mind for years took its toll on his cognitive abilities, leaving him increasingly confused and paranoid. Capone, once sharp and calculating, now struggled to remember even simple things. His ability to command respect from the other prisoners faded as his mind became clouded and his body began to fail him. Once a man feared and respected, Capone was now just another prisoner, his legacy slipping through his fingers like sand. What remained of his empire, once meticulously constructed and maintained, was now lost. From his cell, Capone attempted to stay involved in the criminal world, but the distance between him and the streets of Chicago made it impossible. His former lieutenants, those who once feared and respected him, no longer took his calls. He tried to use his reputation, sending coded messages through intermediaries, but his influence had faded. The man who had once been the king of the underworld was now a mere relic of a forgotten era. As Capone's mental state continued to unravel, so too did his physical health. He became a shell of the man he once was, a tragic figure trapped in a prison of his own making. The man who had once held the city in the palm of his hand now lay in a cold cell, struggling to remember his past and facing the consequences of the life he had built. His time in prison, far from the grandeur he was accustomed to, was marked by isolation, decay, and the bitter realization that no empire, no matter how powerful, could escape the inevitable grip of time. Capone's physical decline was as relentless as it was tragic, an inevitable consequence of years of excess, indulgence, and a criminal life that had no regard for the toll it took on one's body. By the time Capone was sent to prison, His once towering figure had begun to wither under the weight of his own vices. The same man who had once commanded respect and fear with his ruthless, unyielding will, now struggled with an insidious disease that ravaged not just his body, but his mind as well. Syphilis, contracted years earlier, had eaten away at Capone's sanity. It had been slow at first, the symptoms easily dismissed, but it eventually consumed him, gnawing away at the very core of who he was. As the disease progressed, it took a toll on his mental faculties. His sharp intellect, which had once been his greatest asset, became clouded by confusion and paranoia. Capone, who had ruled the streets of Chicago with a clear vision of power, now found himself incapable of even managing the smallest details of his criminal empire. His mind was no longer the finely tuned machine that had once orchestrated the rise of the outfit. It was now clouded, unstable, and increasingly unreliable. The physical symptoms were no less cruel. Once a strong and imposing figure, Capone's health deteriorated rapidly. His body, once filled with energy and vitality, began to wither, plagued by a series of ailments that were both the result of his disease and the lifestyle he had led. The man who had once held the world in his hands now found himself unable to walk without assistance, barely able to function, let alone lead his empire. While Capone languished in his prison cell, the outfit, his empire, began to crumble without his steady hand. Once a well-oiled machine with Capone at the center, it now operated in disarray. His lieutenants, once loyal and dependable, found themselves increasingly unsure of their place in a world where Capone's voice was no longer the commanding force it had once been. Rival gangs, sensing weakness, began to seize opportunities, and the outfit, once a symbol of fear and power, started to fracture. Capone's battle with illness wasn't just physical, it was psychological. His pride, the very thing that had made him so formidable, was now a source of torment. The man who had once been untouchable, who had risen from the streets to control an empire, was now confined to a prison cell, his body failing him, his mind slipping further into chaos. His inability to control the outfit was a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. His empire, built on fear and respect, had slipped beyond his grasp, and in his weakened state, he was unable to stop its disintegration. Capone's final days were a far cry from the glory and terror that once defined him. The once feared gangster, whose name had been whispered in both awe and fear, was now a shadow of his former self. His health had crumbled under the weight of years of criminal excess, and his mind, ravaged by syphilis, had betrayed him. In the cold, isolated walls of his prison cell, Capone was no longer the man who ruled Chicago with an iron fist. He had become a frail, broken figure, forgotten by many, but never quite fully absent from the memories of those who had once feared him. The power he once commanded had slipped from his grasp. His empire, once a vast and well-organized criminal network, had unraveled in his absence. The outfit, now disorganized and fractured, had no place for a man who could no longer lead. Capone's final days were marked by a deep sense of regret as he slowly came to terms with the consequences of his actions. The man who had once crushed his enemies without hesitation now found himself reflecting on a life of violence, betrayal, and manipulation. There was a certain irony in it all. The man who had built an empire on fear and brutality had been reduced to a shell of a person, unable to even hold a meaningful conversation. His body, once strong and imposing, had grown weak, his face lined with the wear of both time and disease. Capone spent much of his time in a fog of confusion, unable to connect with those around him, his legacy slipping further away with each passing moment. As death loomed, Capone's reflections turned inward. He knew that his days were numbered, and the sense of finality in his cell was palpable. The once untouchable kingpin, who had lived a life of excess and unrestrained power, now faced the inevitable conclusion to his story. In the cold, stark walls of the prison, He was forced to confront the very same questions he had avoided in life. What had it all meant? Was there redemption for a man like him? Could a life built on violence and fear ever truly find peace? In the end, Capone's final days were marked by a quiet death that mirrored the way his empire had crumbled slowly, painfully, and without the grand finale he might have imagined. He died not in a hail of bullets or in a blaze of glory, but in a prison cell, alone with his thoughts. The man who had once controlled the streets of Chicago, who had struck fear into the hearts of millions, was now forgotten by many, his name reduced to a ghostly memory. The final chapter of Capone's story had come to a close, and with it, the legend of the once feared gangster faded into the shadows of history. When Al Capone passed away, it was the end of an era defined by ruthless ambition, power, and a violent grip on Chicago's underworld. His death marked not only the end of his reign but also the beginning of a shift in the way organized crime was perceived in America. Chicago, the city that had been his empire, now stood in the shadow of a legacy both feared and admired. Capone's death was a quiet one, the result of a long battle with the syphilis that had ravaged his mind and body, but it was still a significant moment in history. The king of the Chicago outfit, the man who had once been untouchable, had been dethroned by time and disease. For the public, Capone's death didn't spark the kind of celebration one might expect from the fall of such a notorious figure. Instead, there was a sense of weary acknowledgement. People had grown accustomed to the myth of Capone, the man who was both a villain and a savior in the eyes of many. He had funded hospitals, schools, and other public works, earning him a certain level of affection in Chicago's poorer neighborhoods. But beneath that public persona was the brutal reality of his criminal empire, one built on bloodshed, intimidation, and fear. To some, Capone was a hero who had played the game of survival and won, while to others, he was a symbol of everything wrong with the lawlessness that had plagued the city. In the mafia, Capone's death left a void. His empire, once vast and powerful, had fractured during his imprisonment. His lieutenants, once loyal, began to splinter as the outfit struggled to maintain its grip on the city. The power vacuum left in Capone's wake was filled by rival factions, each looking to carve out their own slice of the pie. The legacy of Capone's reign lingered in the streets, but it was no longer the driving force behind the city's criminal activities. His death didn't immediately bring an end to organized crime, but it did mark the end of a certain kind of gangster, one who ruled with a combination of charm, violence, and overwhelming force. For law enforcement, Capone's death was both a relief and a reminder of the ever-present threat of organized crime. The FBI and local police had spent years trying to bring him down, and while they had succeeded in doing so through tax evasion charges, his death was a reminder that the criminal landscape had changed. Capone had been a symbol of the corruption and violence that could thrive in the underworld, but his passing didn't signal the end of the mafia's influence on American society. It simply meant that the face of crime in Chicago and across the country would be different from here on out. Al Capone's death didn't mark the end of his legacy either. His name became synonymous with the mafia, a symbol of both the allure and the danger of the criminal life. His story was retold in books, movies, and documentaries, keeping his memory alive long after his death. In the end, Capone's death was more than just the end of a man. It was the closing of one chapter in the saga of organized crime, one that would continue to evolve, even without its most infamous figurehead. When Al Capone died, it wasn't just the end of a notorious criminal's life. It was the birth of a legend. The media, always hungry for a sensational story, turned his death into something far more than a natural conclusion to a criminal empire. The headlines were filled with lurid details about his final years, his decline in health, and the once feared gangster who had been reduced to a shadow of his former self. But the media frenzy surrounding his death did more than simply recount the fall of a powerful figure. It turned Capone into a larger-than-life myth, a symbol of both the allure and the danger of the gangster lifestyle. Capone's story was no longer just about a man who had built a criminal empire through violence and intimidation. It became the story of a man who had fought against the law, who had survived a system that tried to bring him down time and time again. The myth that surrounded him only grew as details of his life, his charm, and his public persona were sensationalized. The Capone that the media portrayed was a man who had lived life on his own terms, a man who had both ruled the streets of Chicago and managed to remain untouchable for years. He was no longer just a criminal. He was a symbol of defiance, a testament to the power of one man's ambition. In the years following his death, Capone's story took on a life of its own. The myth-making began to overshadow the reality of his actions. While he was certainly a violent criminal responsible for countless deaths, the image that the public came to hold of him was that of a larger-than-life figure, part villain, part folk hero. The criminal activities that had made him infamous became secondary to the persona that had been built around him. People began to focus more on the myth of Capone than on the very real consequences of his actions. He became a symbol of the Prohibition era, a man who had managed to conquer Chicago and had done so with a smile, even as he left a trail of blood and broken lives behind him. Movies, books, and documentaries kept Capone's memory alive, and in doing so, they cemented his place in American history as something more than just a gangster. His story became intertwined with the narrative of the American dream gone wrong. He was a self-made man who had risen from nothing, built an empire, and fallen from grace. His life, the perfect tragedy. This tragic myth-making ensured that Capone would forever be remembered not just as a criminal, but as a figure whose very name came to represent the pursuit of power and the consequences that followed. Through the media, Capone's death transformed him into a legend. The real man, the ruthless, violent gangster, was gone, but the myth he had cultivated lived on. In the end, Al Capone became more than a criminal. He became a symbol, an enduring figure in American pop culture, and a reminder of the complex relationship between crime, power, and myth. Al Capone's death in 1947 left behind more than just a legacy of criminality. It created a vacuum in Chicago's underworld, a void that would reshape the city's criminal landscape for years to come. While Capone had been an untouchable figure, his death marked the end of an era, and with it, the collapse of the empire he had built. His reign had been marked by ruthless violence and iron-fisted control, but in the wake of his passing, the streets of Chicago grew quiet, at least for a time. The once mighty empire that had stretched its influence across the city and beyond began to crumble, and with it came a power struggle among the remaining players in organized crime. Capone's absence left a massive hole in the power structure of the Chicago outfit. For decades, Capone had been the undisputed king of organized crime in the city. He had controlled everything from bootlegging to gambling, and his word had been law in the criminal underworld. His death, however, created an opportunity for those who had once operated under his shadow to rise to power. The outfit, now without its leader, was fragmented, and various factions scrambled to claim control of the lucrative criminal enterprises Capone had once overseen. Rival gangs that had once been at odds with Capone saw an opportunity to push their influence, while those loyal to Capone's legacy fought to maintain what little control they could. The first challenge came from within the outfit itself. With Capone's top lieutenants either imprisoned or struggling to maintain power, the syndicate's cohesion faltered. The power vacuum led to infighting, with ambitious men trying to seize the reins of power. The most notable of these figures was Paul, the waiter, Ricca, who, along with his associates, took control of the outfit's operations. Ricca's rise, however, was far from smooth. There were attempts by other factions to challenge his dominance, but the outfit, now a shadow of its former self, lacked the unity and sheer force that Capone had once commanded. As new players emerged in the wake of Capone's death, the Chicago underworld became more fragmented. Smaller, independent crews began to take hold in areas Capone had once controlled. and the overall structure of organized crime in the city shifted. The once powerful Chicago outfit was now facing intense competition, not only from other criminal organizations but from law enforcement, which had become more vigilant after Capone's arrest and conviction. The federal government, having taken down the notorious Gangster, now set its sights on a wider array of targets, determined to dismantle the remnants of Capone's criminal empire. The death of Al Capone did not mark the end of organized crime in Chicago. Instead, it set the stage for a new era of power struggles, where new faces would rise to fill the void left by the king of crime. The power vacuum created by Capone's passing ensured that the criminal underworld would remain a turbulent and dangerous place, with new players fighting for control and old rivalries continuing to fuel violence and chaos. Al Capone's legacy looms large, not only in the history of organized crime but also in the collective consciousness of America and the world. Though he died more than 7 decades ago, the myth of Capone endures, a testament to his larger-than-life persona. His life, marked by both unimaginable brutality and surprising charm, has become synonymous with the criminal underworld and the roaring 1920s. Capone's influence is evident in the way the public imagines the mafia, ruthless, charismatic, and driven by an insatiable thirst for power. But his legacy is not just about the fear he instilled or the wealth he amassed. It is also about the cultural icon he became, the face of the American gangster. In the decades following his death, Capone's story became an evergreen subject for filmmakers, writers, and artists. From films like Scarface to documentaries and television shows, the tale of Capone's rise, rule, and fall continues to captivate audiences. He became, in a sense, the embodiment of the American criminal dream, a man who clawed his way from nothing to the top of the underworld, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. His story is one of contradictions: a man of extraordinary wealth, who was also a violent thug, a philanthropist, who built soup kitchens but also orchestrated countless murders. This duality is part of what makes his legacy so compelling, a combination of admiration and revulsion that resonates with modern audiences. Yet Capone's criminal activities were far from ordinary. His operations, from bootlegging to gambling to prostitution, reshaped not only the criminal landscape but also the very fabric of American society during the Prohibition era. In many ways, Capone was a symbol of the era's defiance against authority. His brazen disregard for the law, his control over the streets of Chicago, and his ability to manipulate public opinion through both fear and charm set a precedent for future crime bosses. His legacy is not just about the crimes he committed, but about how he redefined the role of organized crime in American culture. Even today, Capone's impact can be felt. His name is synonymous with power, violence, and ambition, but also with the complexities of the American dream. His story has been romanticized and mythologized, making him a symbol of the gangster archetype. Modern crime fiction, whether in books, movies, or television, often draws from the template he helped create. The mystique surrounding Capone's life and crimes still shapes the way we view criminal enterprises, their leaders, and their place in our social narrative. Capone's lasting influence is a reminder that some legacies, no matter how dark or violent, never truly fade. His name is etched into the annals of history, not just as a notorious gangster, but as a figure whose story continues to captivate and shape the public imagination.